In the heart of medieval Europe, a kingdom rose from the rugged mountains of the Balkans to become one of the continent's most powerful empires. Yet today, most people have never heard of it. For over 2 centuries, the Serbian Empire dominated southeastern Europe, stretching from the Danube River to the gates of Constantinople, rivaling Byzantium itself in wealth, culture, and military might. This is the story of the Nemanjić dynasty, whose remarkable rulers transformed a collection of feuding principalities into a sophisticated medieval state. From Stefan Nemanja's unification of Serbian lands in 1166 to the empire's tragic collapse at Kosovo in 1389, will follow the rise and fall of a forgotten European power. The great migrations that swept across Europe in the 6th and 7th centuries would reshape the continent forever. Among the many peoples on the move were the Slavs, farmers, warriors, and settlers who would journey hundreds of miles from their original homelands to establish new lives in the ruins of the Roman Empire. In the mountainous regions of the Balkans, these migrations would plant the seeds of what would one day become the Serbian Empire. To understand how the Serbs came to dominate southeastern Europe, we must first travel back to a time when the Byzantine Empire was fighting for its very survival. The year was 626, and Emperor Heraclius faced a crisis that threatened to destroy what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Avars, a nomadic confederation from the Eurasian steppes, had swept into the Balkans with devastating force. These skilled horsemen had conquered vast territories and were pressing toward Constantinople itself, the heart of Byzantine power. The Avars were not merely raiders, they were empire builders who had established a powerful state stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the Adriatic Sea. Their military machine seemed unstoppable, combining traditional nomadic cavalry tactics with sophisticated siege warfare learned from their encounters with more settled peoples. For the Byzantines, who had already lost much of their western territories to Germanic tribes and were simultaneously fighting the Persian Empire in the east, the Avar threat represented an existential challenge. It was in this desperate hour that Emperor Heraclius made a decision that would alter the course of Balkan history. Rather than face the Avars alone, he chose to ally with another group of warriors who had recently appeared on the empire's northern frontier, the Slavs. These agricultural peoples had been migrating southward for generations, but unlike the Avars, they seemed more interested in settling and farming than in pure conquest. The Slavic peoples who would become the Serbs had originated in the vast forests and plains north of the Carpathian Mountains. They lived in small tribal communities, practiced agriculture, and possessed a warrior culture that emphasized loyalty to kinship groups and local chieftains. Their society was organized around extended family units called zadruga, which would remain a fundamental aspect of Serbian social organization for centuries to come. When these Slavic warriors proved their effectiveness against the Avars, Emperor Heraclius made them an offer that would change everything. In exchange for their military service and their promise to defend the empire's Balkan territories, he would grant them permission to settle permanently in the regions they had helped to liberate. This was not simply a desperate bargain struck in wartime. It was a calculated imperial policy designed to create a buffer zone of friendly peoples along Byzantium's vulnerable northern border. The consequences of this arrangement were profound and lasting. The Slavic settlers who accepted Heraclius's offer did not arrive in an empty land. The Balkans had been home to numerous peoples for millennia. Illyrian tribes had established kingdoms and city-states throughout the western regions. Thracian peoples dominated the eastern areas with their own rich cultural traditions. Dacian communities had built fortified settlements in the northern territories. The descendants of Roman colonists and administrators still maintained Latin-speaking enclaves in many urban centers. Rather than simply displacing these existing populations, the arriving Slavs began a complex process of cultural mixing and adaptation. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a fascinating picture of gradual integration rather than wholesale replacement. Slavic pottery styles begin to appear alongside traditional local crafts. Burial practices show the adoption of both Slavic and pre-Slavic customs. Most importantly, the genetic and linguistic evidence suggests extensive intermarriage between the newcomers and the established inhabitants. This process of ethnogenesis, the formation of new ethnic identities through the mixing of different peoples, was not unique to the Balkans, but it was particularly intensive in this region. The Slavs brought their language, their agricultural techniques, and their social organization. The local populations contributed their knowledge of the terrain, their established trade networks, and their connections to the broader Mediterranean world. From this fusion emerged the ancestors of the medieval Serbs. The new communities that formed during the 7th and 8th centuries were neither purely Slavic nor purely indigenous. They were something entirely new. These people adopted Slavic dialects as their primary language, but these dialects were enriched with vocabulary borrowed from Latin, Greek, Illyrian, and Thracian sources. They maintained Slavic customs and legal traditions, but adapted them to local conditions and existing practices. The geographic landscape of the Balkans played a crucial role in shaping these emerging communities. The region's rugged mountains and deep valleys created natural boundaries that encouraged the development of distinct local identities. The Dinaric Alps, stretching along the Adriatic coast, formed a formidable barrier between coastal and inland regions. The Balkan Mountains in the east separated the Danube basin from the Aegean lowlands. These geographic features meant that while all these communities shared common Slavic roots, they began to develop their own particular characteristics from the very beginning. In the territories that would later become the heartland of medieval Serbia, several distinct tribal groups emerged during this period. The archaeological record suggests that the strongest concentrations of Slavic settlement occurred in the river valleys of central Serbia, particularly along the Morava River and its tributaries. These fertile valleys provided excellent agricultural land and served as natural corridors for trade and communication. The relationship between these early Serbian communities and the Byzantine Empire was complex and constantly evolving. While Emperor Heraclius had granted them permission to settle, the Byzantines never abandoned their claim to sovereignty over these territories. From Constantinople's perspective, the Slavic settlers were foederati, allied peoples who owed military service to the empire in exchange for land and protection. From the Slavic perspective, however, their obligation was to the emperor who had granted them settlement rights, not necessarily to his successors or to the empire as an institution. The scattered tribal communities that had emerged from the Great Migrations were about to take their first steps towards statehood. In the mountainous region that would later be known as Raška, ambitious chieftains were beginning to unite the various Serbian clans under a single authority. This process would give birth to the first organized Serbian state and establish a dynasty that would rule for nearly 2 centuries. The man who achieved this remarkable unification was Prince Vyacheslav, whose name appears in the earliest Serbian historical records from the late 8th century. Vyacheslav represented a new type of Serbian leader, not merely a tribal chieftain governing a single valley or clan, but a ruler capable of coordinating the activities of multiple communities across a substantial territory. His achievement was all the more impressive because it occurred during a period when the Byzantine Empire was struggling to maintain control over its Balkan territories. The Vlastimirovich dynasty that Vyacheslav founded took its name from his son, Prince Vlastimir, who would prove to be one of the most significant rulers in early Serbian history. When Vlastimir assumed power in the early 9th century, he inherited a principality that was still relatively modest in scope, centered in the mountainous interior of what is now central Serbia. However, the strategic location of this territory would prove to be its greatest asset. The Serbian Principality under Vlastimir controlled several crucial mountain passes that connected the Adriatic coast with the Danube River Valley. These routes had been important since Roman times, but they became even more valuable as trade began to recover from the disruptions of the migration period. Merchants traveling between Constantinople and the growing markets of Central Europe had to pass through Serbian territory, providing the principality with both customs revenues and valuable intelligence about the movements of potential enemies and allies. Vlastimir's most severe challenge came from an unexpected direction. The First Bulgarian Empire, under Khan Prezien I, had been expanding westward and now posed a direct threat to Serbian independence. The Bulgarians had established a powerful state north of the Balkan mountains and were seeking to extend their control over the entire region. For the Bulgarians, the Serbian Principality represented both an obstacle to their expansion and a valuable prize that would give them access to the Adriatic trade routes. The conflict that erupted between Serbs and Bulgarians in the mid-9th century was more than a simple border dispute. It was a struggle that would determine whether the Serbs could maintain their political independence or would be absorbed into the growing Bulgarian state. The war began around 855 when Bulgarian forces launched a major invasion of Serbian territory. The Bulgarians expected a quick victory against what they assumed were disorganized tribal communities. Prince Vlastimir, however, had spent years preparing for exactly this type of conflict. He had forged alliances with neighboring Serbian clans and had developed a defensive strategy that took full advantage of the mountainous terrain. Rather than meeting the Bulgarian army in open battle, where their superior numbers would be decisive, Vlastimir chose to fight a campaign of ambushes and strategic withdrawals that gradually wore down the invading forces. The Serbian strategy proved brilliantly effective. Bulgarian forces found themselves constantly harassed by Serbian raiders who knew every mountain path and valley in the region. Supply lines were cut, isolated units were destroyed, and the Bulgarian army never had the opportunity to use its numerical advantage in a decisive engagement. After months of frustrating warfare, the Bulgarian forces were forced to withdraw, leaving the Serbian Principality not only independent but strengthened by victory. This triumph against the Bulgarians had profound consequences for the development of Serbian statehood. It demonstrated that a unified Serbian principality could successfully resist the expansion of major regional powers. More importantly, it established the Vlastimirovich dynasty's legitimacy not only among their own people but in the eyes of other European rulers. Success in warfare was the ultimate test of medieval kingship, and Vlastimir had passed that test convincingly. The victory also allowed Prince Vlastimir to expand Serbian territory significantly. Areas that had previously been contested between Serbs and Bulgarians now fell securely under Serbian control. The principality extended its authority over much of modern-day Montenegro, eastern Bosnia, and parts of Herzegovina. This expansion brought new resources and populations under Serbian rule, but it also created new challenges in terms of administration and defense. Under Vlastimir's successors, the Serbian Principality continued to develop the institutions necessary for effective governance. Prince Mutimir, who ruled in the late 9th century, faced the complex task of maintaining Serbian independence while navigating the competing demands of the Byzantine Empire and the Bulgarian state. Both of these major powers viewed the Serbian Principality as either a potential ally or a threat that needed to be controlled. Mutimir chose to align the Serbian Principality more closely with Byzantium, recognizing that the empire offered better protection against Bulgarian expansion than could be achieved through isolation. This decision required careful diplomatic balancing, as the Serbs needed to maintain enough autonomy to preserve their distinct identity while providing sufficient support to their Byzantine allies to ensure continued protection. The relationship between the Serbian Principality and Byzantium during this period was neither simple vassalage nor complete independence. The Serbs acknowledged Byzantine suzerainty in exchange for imperial recognition of their territory and protection against external threats. In practice, this meant that Serbian princes were expected to provide military assistance when requested and to avoid forming alliances with Byzantine enemies, but they retained control over internal affairs and local governance. This arrangement proved beneficial for both parties. The Byzantines gained a reliable buffer state that could help defend their northern frontier without requiring significant imperial resources. The Serbs obtained legitimacy and protection that allowed them to focus on internal development rather than constant warfare for survival. Trade flourished under this protected status, bringing new wealth and ideas into Serbian territory. The pinnacle of Vlastimirovich achievement came under Prince Czeslaw, who ruled during the first half of the 10th century. Czaslav inherited a principality that had grown substantially in both territory and sophistication since the days of Vyacheslav. He proved to be an exceptionally capable ruler who expanded Serbian authority over the largest territory the dynasty would ever control. Under his leadership, the Serbian principality extended its influence from the Adriatic coast to the Danube River, encompassing much of present-day Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. Czaslav's success was built on his ability to balance Serbian interests against the competing pressures of regional great powers. The Bulgarian Empire remained a constant threat, while the Byzantine Empire continued to demand loyalty and military support. Additionally, the Hungarian kingdom was emerging as a new force in the northern Balkans, creating a third major power that had to be considered in Serbian strategic planning. Perhaps most importantly, Czaslav succeeded in creating a sense of Serbian identity that transcended the traditional tribal loyalties that had previously divided the region's population. He promoted the development of Serbian cultural traditions and supported the growth of Serbian religious institutions that helped unify his diverse territories. Under his rule, the scattered communities that had emerged from the Great Migrations were finally becoming a coherent people with shared institutions and common purposes. However, the very success of the Vlastimirović dynasty contained the seeds of its eventual downfall. The extensive territories that Czaslav controlled were difficult to govern effectively with the administrative tools available to a 10th-century medieval state. Local nobles had gained considerable autonomy in their own regions, and the bonds of loyalty that held the principality together depended heavily on the personal authority of the prince himself. When Prince Czaslav died around 960, the careful balance he had maintained collapsed rapidly. The principality fragmented as different factions of nobles competed for control, each claiming legitimacy as Czaslav's successor. Without a clear system of succession or strong central institutions to maintain unity, the first Serbian state disintegrated within a generation of its greatest ruler's death. The death of Prince Czaslav around 960 marked the end of the first chapter in Serbian statehood. As the Vlastimirović principality crumbled into competing factions, Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos in Constantinople saw an opportunity to restore direct Byzantine control over the Balkans. What followed was a century of imperial reconquest that would temporarily erase Serbian independence, only to see it reborn in an unexpected location along the Adriatic coast. The Byzantine reconquest was swift and methodical. Imperial armies encountered little organized resistance as they advanced into former Serbian territories. The local nobles who had emerged from the collapse of Czaslav's principality lacked both the unity and the resources necessary to resist the empire's professional military forces. One by one, the fortified towns and strategic mountain passes that had formed the backbone of Serbian independence fell under imperial control. Emperor Constantine VII was not content merely to occupy Serbian lands. He intended to transform them into securely held imperial provinces. Byzantine administrators replaced local Serbian nobles in key positions. Imperial taxation systems were implemented to extract revenue for the imperial treasury. Most significantly, the empire began a systematic effort to integrate the Serbian population into the broader Byzantine cultural and religious framework. This process of Byzantinization was more complex than simple military occupation. The empire had learned from previous experiences that lasting control required more than garrison troops and tribute collection. Byzantine officials promoted Greek language and culture in urban centers while respecting local customs in rural areas where such changes might provoke resistance. The Orthodox Church played a crucial role in this strategy as Byzantine bishops worked to strengthen ties between local Serbian communities and Constantinople. For nearly a century, it appeared that Serbian independence had been permanently extinguished. The administrative efficiency of Byzantine rule brought certain benefits to the region. Trade networks were restored and expanded under imperial protection. Urban centers grew as merchants gained access to the wider Byzantine commercial system. Legal disputes were resolved according to imperial law codes rather than local customs that varied from valley to valley. However, this apparent stability masked growing tensions beneath the surface. The Serbian population had not forgotten their recent independence, and Byzantine rule, however efficient, was still foreign rule imposed by military force. Local nobles who had been displaced by imperial administrators harbored resentments that would eventually find expression in armed resistance. Perhaps most importantly, the empire's attempt to integrate Serbian territories had inadvertently created new forms of Serbian identity that would prove more durable than the old tribal loyalties. The spark that would reignite Serbian independence came from an unexpected quarter. In the coastal region of Duklja, which encompassed much of present-day Montenegro and southern Dalmatia, a local noble named Stefan Vojislav began organizing resistance to Byzantine rule around 1040. Duklja had been part of the original Vlastimirović Principality, but its coastal location and different economic orientation had always given it a somewhat distinct character from the inland Serbian territories. Stefan Vojislav was uniquely positioned to challenge Byzantine authority. As a member of the local nobility, he understood the strengths and weaknesses of imperial administration in the region. His family controlled significant territory around the coastal town of Bar, giving him access to maritime trade networks that provided both wealth and contacts with potential allies. Most importantly, he possessed the military skills and political acumen necessary to transform local discontent into organized rebellion. The revolt that Stefan Vojislav launched against Byzantine rule in 1040 was carefully planned and expertly executed. Rather than attempting to confront imperial forces directly, he employed the same guerrilla tactics that had served Prince Vlastimir so well in his war against the Bulgarians. Serbian fighters struck at isolated Byzantine garrisons and then melted away into the mountainous terrain before imperial reinforcements could arrive. The geographic characteristics of Duklja made it an ideal base for this type of warfare. The region's rugged mountains provided numerous hiding places and defensive positions that were virtually impossible for conventional armies to assault successfully. The Adriatic coastline offered potential escape routes and access to supplies that could not be easily cut off by land-based imperial forces. Most importantly, the local population provided information and support that made it extremely difficult for Byzantine forces to track and engage the Serbian rebels. Stefan Vojislav's rebellion succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations. Within 3 years, he had driven Byzantine forces out of most of Duklja and had begun extending his authority over neighboring territories. The success of his revolt inspired similar uprisings in other former Serbian regions, creating a cascade of rebellions that stretched imperial resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively. The establishment of the independent Principality of Duklja under Stefan Vojislav marked the beginning of a new phase in Serbian political development. Unlike the earlier Vlastimirović Principality, which had been primarily a confederation of inland mountain tribes, Duklja was oriented toward the Adriatic Sea and the broader Mediterranean world. This geographic orientation would profoundly influence the character of the new Serbian state. Under Stefan Vojislav and his successors, Duklja developed extensive commercial and diplomatic relationships with other Adriatic powers. The principality maintained regular contact with Venice, which was emerging as a major commercial force in the region. Trade agreements were negotiated with Norman kingdoms in southern Italy. Most significantly, Duklja established diplomatic relations with the Papal States, marking the beginning of a complex relationship between Serbian rulers and the Roman Catholic Church that would influence Balkan politics for centuries. The son of Stefan Vojislav, Prince Mihailo, proved to be an even more capable ruler than his father. Mihailo expanded Duklja's territory significantly, bringing much of present-day Montenegro, parts of southern Dalmatia, and portions of northern Albania under his control. More importantly, he succeeded in gaining international recognition for his principality's independence. In 1077, Pope Gregory VII granted Mihailo the title of king, making him the first Serbian ruler to receive formal recognition of royal status from a major European power. The papal recognition of King Mihailo represented a diplomatic triumph that elevated Duklja's status far beyond what its modest size and resources might otherwise have warranted. The title carried significant symbolic weight in medieval Europe, where royal dignity was closely associated with divine approval and legitimate authority. For the Serbian people, it represented proof that their independence was not merely a temporary rebellion against imperial authority, but a permanent achievement recognized by the highest authorities in Christendom. King Mihailo used his enhanced status to pursue an ambitious program of territorial expansion and political consolidation. He forged marriage alliances with other Balkan rulers, extending Duklja's influence through diplomatic means, as well as military conquest. His court became a center of cultural development where Serbian traditions were preserved and enhanced through contact with broader European cultural movements. The reign of Mihailo's successor, King Constantine Bodan, marked the apex of Duklja's power and influence. Constantine Bodan ruled from 1081 to 10101, and during his 20-year reign, the kingdom reached its greatest territorial extent. Under his leadership, Duklja controlled much of the Western Balkans and had established itself as a significant regional power capable of influencing events far beyond its borders. Constantine Bodan's most significant achievement was the expansion of Duklja's authority over the inland Serbian territories that had remained under Byzantine control. In 1083, he appointed his nephews Vukan and Marko as rulers of Raška, the mountainous region that had been the heart of the original Vlastimirović Principality. This appointment represented more than simple territorial expansion. It marked the reunification of the Serbian lands under a single dynasty for the first time since the collapse of Časlav's principality over a century earlier. The system of governance that Constantine Bodan established in his expanded kingdom reflected the complex ethnic and religious diversity of his territories. Each major region retained its own traditional laws and customs while acknowledging the king's ultimate authority. Local nobles maintained significant autonomy in exchange for military service and tribute payments. This decentralized approach allowed the kingdom to grow rapidly without provoking the kind of local resistance that had plagued earlier attempts at Balkan unification. However, the very success of Constantine Bodan's expansion contained the seeds of future problems. The kingdom had grown too large and diverse to be effectively governed by the administrative methods available to an 11th century medieval state. The various regions maintained their own identities and interests, which sometimes conflicted with royal policies. Most significantly, the inland territories around Raška began to develop their own sense of identity and ambition that would eventually challenge Duklja's supremacy. The death of King Constantine Bodan in 1101 marked a turning point that would forever alter the balance of power within the Serbian lands. While Duklja descended into chaos and civil war, the mountainous inland region of Raška was about to emerge as the new center of Serbian political authority. The ambitious rulers of this previously subordinate territory would soon eclipse their former overlords and establish a dynasty that would transform Serbia into a major European power. The internal crisis that engulfed Duklja after Constantine Bodan's death provided the perfect opportunity for his nephew Vukan to assert his independence. As the appointed ruler of Raška, Vukan had spent nearly 2 decades building his power base in the mountainous interior while nominally serving his uncle's interests. When the kingdom began to fragment following Bodan's death, Vukan faced a crucial decision. He could attempt to claim the throne of Duklja for himself, or he could break away entirely and establish Raška as an independent principality. Vukan chose independence, and his timing proved to be masterful. The succession crisis in Duklja had created multiple claimants to the throne, each supported by different factions of nobles and backed by various foreign powers. Rather than becoming entangled in this destructive conflict, Vukan proclaimed himself Grand Prince of Serbia, asserting authority not just over Raška, but over all Serbian lands. This bold declaration represented more than simple opportunism. It reflected Vukan's understanding that the center of Serbian power was shifting from the Adriatic coast to the continental interior. The The geographic advantages that had made Duklja powerful in the 11th century were becoming less relevant as political conditions changed across the Balkans. The coastal principality's strength had been built on maritime trade and diplomatic connections with Mediterranean powers. However, the rise of new continental powers, particularly the Hungarian kingdom to the north and the resurgent Byzantine Empire to the south, meant that control of inland territories and mountain passes was becoming more strategically valuable than access to coastal ports. Vukan's declaration of independence immediately attracted the hostile attention of the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had been waiting for an opportunity to reassert imperial control over the Serbian lands, and the fragmentation of Constantine Bodin's kingdom provided exactly the opening he needed. Between 1089 and 1091, Byzantine forces launched a sustained campaign against both Duklja and Raška, seeking to exploit the divisions between the Serbian rulers to restore imperial authority over the entire region. The Byzantine offensive initially achieved considerable success against the weakened and divided Serbian territories. Imperial forces captured several key strongholds in Duklja and forced many local nobles to acknowledge Byzantine suzerainty. However, when the empire's armies turned their attention to Raška, they encountered much stiffer resistance than they had anticipated. Vukan had used his years as Constantine Bodin's subordinate to study Byzantine military methods and to prepare defensive strategies specifically designed to counter imperial tactics. The mountainous terrain of Raška proved to be Vukan's greatest ally in resisting the Byzantine invasion. The region's deep valleys and narrow passes created natural choke points where small Serbian forces could hold up much larger imperial armies. Vukan's strategy was to avoid pitched battles where Byzantine numerical superiority would be decisive, instead relying on ambushes, raids, and strategic withdrawals that gradually exhausted the invading forces. This defensive campaign demonstrated that Raška possessed advantages that Duklja had never enjoyed. While the coastal principality had been vulnerable to attacks from both land and sea, Raška's inland position meant that enemies could only approach through a limited number of mountain passes, all of which could be heavily fortified and defended. The region's harsh winters made extended military campaigns extremely difficult for armies not familiar with local conditions. Most importantly, Raška's population was more homogeneous and united than Duklja's diverse coastal communities, providing more reliable support for their rulers' resistance efforts. The success of Vukan's resistance against the Byzantine Empire established Raška's credibility as the legitimate successor to earlier Serbian states. Other Serbian nobles who had initially hesitated to support his claim to leadership began to recognize that he offered their best hope for maintaining independence against foreign conquest. Gradually, territories that had previously been part of Constantine Bodin's kingdom began to acknowledge Vukan's authority rather than attempting to maintain their own independence or submitting to Byzantine rule. Vukan's diplomatic skills proved to be as important as his military capabilities in establishing Raška's dominance. He forged a crucial alliance with the Hungarian kingdom, which was eager to prevent Byzantine expansion into territories that Hungary considered part of its own sphere of influence. This alliance provided Raška with a powerful patron that could offer military assistance and diplomatic support when needed. In exchange, Vukan acknowledged Hungarian influence over certain border regions and agreed to coordinate his foreign policy with Hungarian interests. The relationship with Hungary marked a significant shift in Serbian diplomatic orientation. Previous Serbian rulers had looked primarily toward Byzantium, the Papal States, or other Mediterranean powers for international support. Vukan's alliance with Hungary represented the beginning of a more continental approach to foreign policy that would characterize Serbian diplomacy for the next several centuries. This shift reflected the changing balance of power in southeastern Europe, where continental kingdoms were becoming more important than maritime empires. Under Vukan's successors, the Vukanović dynasty continued to strengthen Raška's position as the dominant Serbian principality. Grand Prince Uroš I, who ruled during the early 12th century, expanded Raška's territory significantly and began the process of administrative centralization that would transform the principality from a loose confederation of mountain tribes into a more organized medieval state. He established a system of appointed governors who answered directly to the Grand Prince, rather than ruling as autonomous local nobles. The reign of Uroš I also saw important developments in Raška's relationship with the Orthodox Church. Unlike the rulers of Duklja, who had maintained close ties with the Roman Catholic Church, the Vukanović dynasty aligned itself firmly with Eastern Orthodoxy. This religious orientation helped strengthen bonds with the Byzantine Empire during periods of peaceful relations, while also appealing to the religious sensibilities of Raška's predominantly Orthodox population. Grand Prince Desa, who succeeded Uroš I in the mid-12th century, faced the challenge of defending Raška's independence during a period of renewed Byzantine assertiveness under Emperor Manuel I Komnenos. Manuel was one of the most capable Byzantine emperors of the 12th century, and he was determined to restore imperial control over the Balkans through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manipulation. His strategy involved supporting rival claimants to the Serbian throne, while simultaneously offering generous terms to rulers who would accept Byzantine suzerainty. Desa's response to this Byzantine pressure demonstrated the institutional maturity that Raška had achieved under Vukanović rule. Rather than relying solely on his personal authority or military capabilities, Desa was able to mobilize the resources of an increasingly sophisticated state apparatus. Tax revenues supported professional military forces that could campaign year-round, rather than relying on seasonal levies of peasant soldiers. Diplomatic contacts with foreign powers provided alternative sources of support when Byzantine pressure became too intense. Most importantly, a growing sense of Serbian national identity meant that resistance to foreign domination enjoyed broad popular support. The final decades of Vukanović rule saw Raška achieve a level of stability and prosperity that had been unknown in the Serbian lands since the collapse of Časlav's principality 2 centuries earlier. Trade routes through the principality carried increasing volumes of goods between Hungary and Byzantium, generating customs revenues that supported expanded government activities. Urban centers grew as craftsmen and merchants established permanent workshops and trading houses. Most significantly, a distinctive Serbian culture began to emerge that combined traditional Slavic customs with influences from both Eastern and Western Christianity. This cultural development was particularly evident in the realm of architecture and art, where Serbian builders and artists began to create works that reflected their unique position between the Byzantine and Western European cultural spheres. Churches built during this period combined Byzantine architectural techniques with decorative elements borrowed from Romanesque and early Gothic styles. Illuminated manuscripts produced in Serbian monasteries showed similar cultural synthesis, blending Orthodox theological content with artistic techniques learned from both Eastern and Western sources. In 1166, a pivotal moment arrived that would transform the course of Serbian history forever. The established order of the Vukanović dynasty was about to be shattered by an ambitious nobleman whose vision extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Serbian power. Stefan Nemanja, a member of a cadet branch of the ruling family, was preparing to seize control of Raška and launch a political revolution that would create the foundation for a future Serbian empire. The circumstances that brought Stefan Nemanja to power were rooted in the complex political arrangements that Emperor Manuel I Komnenos had established to control Serbian affairs. Following his successful military campaigns against the previous Vukanović rulers, Manuel had appointed Tihomir, one of 4 brothers from the noble house of Zavida, as the new Grand Prince of Raška. This appointment was part of a deliberate Byzantine strategy to prevent the emergence of another strong Serbian leader by dividing authority among multiple potential rivals. The 4 brothers, Tihomir, Strachimir, Miroslav, and Stefan Nemanja, each controlled significant territories within Raška. But Emperor Manuel had designated Tihomir as the senior ruler responsible for coordinating Serbian policy with imperial interests. This arrangement satisfied Byzantine concerns about Serbian independence, while theoretically preventing the kind of internal conflicts that had weakened earlier Serbian states. However, Manuel's understanding of Serbian politics proved to be fatally flawed. Stefan Nemanja was the youngest of the four brothers, but he possessed qualities that his siblings lacked. Where Tihomir was content to serve as a Byzantine client ruler, Nemanja harbored ambitions for genuine Serbian independence. Where Strachimir and Miroslav focused on governing their own territories, Nemanja developed a comprehensive vision for uniting all Serbian lands under a single authority. Most importantly, while his brothers accepted the limitations that Byzantine oversight imposed on their actions, Nemanja began secretly planning to overthrow the entire system that Manuel had created. The rebellion that Stefan Nemanja launched against his brother Tihomir in 1166 was not a spontaneous uprising, but the culmination of years of careful preparation. Nemanja had used his position as one of the recognized regional lords to build a network of supporters among the Serbian nobility who shared his desire for independence from Byzantine control. He had also cultivated relationships with foreign powers, particularly Hungary and the emerging Papal States, who were interested in limiting Byzantine influence in the Balkans. The military campaign that brought Stefan Nemanja to power demonstrated his exceptional strategic capabilities. Rather than attempting to defeat all three of his brothers simultaneously, he focused his initial efforts on isolating and destroying Tihomir's forces. The decisive battle occurred at Pantino, where Nemanja's army achieved a crushing victory that eliminated Tihomir as a political rival and sent a clear message to Strachimir and Miroslav about the futility of resistance. The speed and completeness of Nemanja's victory shocked both his remaining brothers and the Byzantine court in Constantinople. Within months of launching his rebellion, he had gained control over most of Raška and had begun extending his authority over neighboring Serbian territories. Strachimir and Miroslav, recognizing the hopelessness of their position, submitted to their younger brother's authority rather than face the same fate as Tihomir. Emperor Manuel's response to Nemanja's coup was swift but ultimately ineffective. Byzantine forces launched a punitive expedition into Raška in 1168, expecting to restore imperial authority through a show of force. However, Nemanja had learned valuable lessons from studying the successes and failures of previous Serbian rulers. He avoided the mistakes that had led to earlier defeats while capitalizing on the geographic and political advantages that Raška's position provided. The campaign that followed demonstrated the evolution of Serbian military capabilities under Nemanja's leadership. Unlike earlier Serbian rulers who had relied primarily on defensive strategies, Nemanja combined traditional guerrilla tactics with more sophisticated military operations that took advantage of his enemies' weaknesses. His forces struck at Byzantine supply lines while avoiding direct confrontations that would favor imperial numerical superiority. Most importantly, he coordinated his military activities with diplomatic initiatives designed to complicate Byzantine strategy. The turning point in Nemanja's conflict with Byzantium came when he successfully negotiated Hungarian support for his independence movement. The Hungarian kingdom, under King Bela III, saw an opportunity to weaken Byzantine influence in the Balkans while gaining a valuable ally along their southern frontier. Hungarian military assistance, combined with Nemanja's increasingly effective resistance, eventually forced Emperor Manuel to recognize the futility of attempting to restore direct control over Raška. The peace agreement that ended the Byzantine-Serbian conflict in 1172 represented a diplomatic triumph for Stefan Nemanja. While he formally acknowledged Byzantine suzerainty, the practical terms of the agreement granted him virtually complete autonomy over Serbian internal affairs. More importantly, the emperor recognized Nemanja as the legitimate ruler of all Serbian territories, effectively ending the division of authority that had characterized earlier Byzantine policy toward the region. With his position secure and his independence effectively guaranteed, Stefan Nemanja began the ambitious project of transforming Raška from a regional principality into a major Balkan power. His first priority was the complete unification of the Serbian lands, many of which had remained fragmented since the collapse of Constantine Bodin's kingdom nearly a century earlier. This process required both military conquest and diplomatic negotiation, as some territories were controlled by local nobles, while others remained under direct Byzantine administration. The most significant of Nemanja's territorial acquisitions was the conquest of Duklja around 1180. The coastal principality that had once been the center of Serbian power had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal conflicts and Byzantine pressure. Nemanja's occupation of Duklja reunited the Serbian lands for the first time since Constantine Bodin's death, and gave Raška access to the Adriatic Sea and its valuable trade networks. Stefan Nemanja's approach to governing his expanded territories reflected a sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in ruling a diverse and geographically dispersed population. Rather than attempting to impose uniform administrative structures across all his territories, he developed a flexible system that accommodated local traditions while ensuring central coordination of military and foreign policy. This approach proved crucial in maintaining the loyalty of newly conquered populations who might otherwise have resented rule by an inland mountain principality. The economic policies that Nemanja implemented during his 30-year reign laid the foundation for the prosperity that would characterize later Serbian development. He encouraged trade by improving road networks and providing security for merchant caravans traveling through Serbian territory. Mining operations were expanded to extract the silver and other metals that would become crucial sources of royal revenue. Most importantly, he established stable currency and taxation systems that provided the resources necessary to support expanded government activities. Cultural and religious developments during Nemanja's reign were equally significant for the long-term evolution of Serbian identity. While maintaining the orthodox religious orientation that had characterized earlier Serbian rulers, Nemanja sponsored the construction of numerous churches and monasteries that became centers of learning and artistic achievement. The most famous of these was Studenica Monastery, which he founded as both a royal mausoleum and a center of Serbian religious life. The monastery of Studenica represented more than simply another religious foundation. It embodied Nemanja's vision of Serbian cultural independence and achievement. The architectural style combined traditional Byzantine techniques with innovative elements that reflected specifically Serbian artistic sensibilities. The monastery scriptorium became a center for the production of illuminated manuscripts that preserved and transmitted Serbian historical and religious traditions. Most importantly, Studenica served as a symbol of Serbian cultural sophistication that demonstrated the principality's capacity to create works of lasting artistic value. Stefan Nemanja's family life proved to be as significant for Serbian history as his political and military achievements. His marriage to Ana, a member of the Byzantine nobility, strengthened diplomatic ties with Constantinople while producing sons who would carry forward his dynasty's ambitions. The most important of these were Stefan, who would inherit the throne and become the first crowned king of Serbia, and Rastko, who would achieve fame as Saint Sava, the founder of the independent Serbian Orthodox Church. When Stefan Nemanja abdicated his throne in 1196 to pursue the monastic life, he left behind a unified Serbian state that faced both unprecedented opportunities and formidable challenges. His son Stefan, who inherited the title of Grand Prince, understood that simply maintaining his father's achievements would not be sufficient to secure Serbia's long-term independence. The rapidly changing political landscape of medieval Europe demanded bold initiatives that would elevate Serbia from a regional Balkan principality to a recognized European kingdom with both political legitimacy and religious autonomy. Stefan's inheritance was complicated by the family arrangements that his father had established during his final years. Following traditional Serbian practice, Stefan Nemanja had divided his territories among his sons, with Stefan receiving the core lands of Raška, while his brother Vukan was granted control over the newly conquered territories of Duklja and Zeta. This division was intended to prevent succession conflicts while ensuring that both sons had adequate resources to defend Serbian interests. However, it also created potential for rivalry between brothers who possessed different territorial bases and possibly divergent political ambitions. The first decade of Stefan's reign was marked by the careful balancing act required to maintain Serbian independence while avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed earlier Balkan states. The Byzantine Empire, under Emperor Alexios III Angelus, was experiencing internal instability that limited its capacity to intervene in Serbian affairs. However, this same instability made Byzantium an unreliable ally at a time when Serbia needed international support to consolidate its position. Meanwhile, the growing power of Hungary under King Emmerich presented both opportunities for alliance and risks of domination. Stefan's diplomatic strategy during this period reflected his understanding that Serbia's geographic position between major powers required exceptional political skill to navigate successfully. Rather than committing exclusively to either Byzantine or Hungarian patronage, he pursued a policy of flexible alignment that maximized Serbian autonomy while providing protection against potential threats. This approach required constant attention to shifting international circumstances and the willingness to adjust policies rapidly when conditions changed. The crisis that would test Stefan's leadership came from within his own family. Around 1202, his brother Vukan launched a rebellion that threatened to destroy the unity that Stefan Nemanja had achieved through 3 decades of careful state building. The conflict between the brothers was more than a simple succession dispute. It represented fundamentally different visions of Serbia's future relationship with the major powers of medieval Europe. Vukan's rebellion was backed by Hungarian support, reflecting his belief that Serbia's best interests lay in closer alignment with the Catholic kingdoms of Central Europe. King Emmerich of Hungary saw an opportunity to extend Hungarian influence over Serbian territories while potentially bringing the Serbian Orthodox population into the Catholic sphere. For Vukan, Hungarian support offered the military assistance necessary to overthrow his brother and establish a new political order that would guarantee Serbian independence through Western rather than Byzantine patronage. Stefan's response to his brother's rebellion demonstrated the institutional maturity that the Serbian state had achieved under Nemanjić rule. Rather than relying solely on personal loyalty or traditional tribal allegiances, Stefan was able to mobilize the resources of an increasingly sophisticated governmental apparatus. Professional military forces, supported by regular taxation and administrative coordination, proved more effective than the Hungarian-backed forces that Vukan commanded. Most importantly, Stefan's policies had created genuine popular support among the Serbian population, who recognized that his leadership offered better prospects for maintaining their traditional customs and religious practices. The civil war that raged between 1202 and 1204 devastated much of the Serbian lands and demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of internal division. Towns were sacked, monasteries were destroyed, and agricultural production was severely disrupted. The conflict also attracted foreign intervention that threatened to reduce Serbia to the status of a battleground between competing imperial interests. Hungarian forces operated freely in Western Serbian territories, while Byzantine military units appeared in eastern regions, each supporting their chosen Serbian client. Stefan's eventual victory in 1204 required not only military success, but also diplomatic reconciliation that would restore Serbian unity without creating permanent resentments. His treatment of Vukan after the civil war ended reflected both political wisdom and family loyalty. Rather than executing his brother or confiscating his territories entirely, Stefan negotiated a settlement that restored Vukan to a subordinate position while eliminating the independence that had made rebellion possible. This approach demonstrated Stefan's understanding that lasting stability required healing the divisions that the civil war had created. The experience of the civil war convinced Stefan that Serbia needed stronger international recognition to prevent future foreign interventions in domestic conflicts. The traditional forms of medieval legitimacy, military success, territorial control, and popular support were no longer sufficient to guarantee independence in an increasingly interconnected European political system. What Serbia required was formal recognition from the major authorities of medieval Christendom, the Roman Catholic Church and the Byzantine Empire. Stefan's pursuit of royal recognition from Pope Honorius III represented a diplomatic masterstroke that transformed Serbia's international position. The Pope was eager to expand Catholic influence in the Orthodox Balkans and saw Serbian royal recognition as an opportunity to potentially bring the Serbian Church into communion with Rome. For Stefan, papal recognition offered legitimacy that would be acknowledged throughout Western Europe while potentially deterring Hungarian aggression against a Catholic-recognized kingdom. The negotiations that led to Stefan's coronation as king in 1217 involved complex diplomatic maneuvering that required careful attention to both Catholic and Orthodox sensibilities. Stefan needed to satisfy papal requirements for royal recognition without alienating his predominantly Orthodox subjects or permanently damaging relationships with Byzantium. The solution he developed involved formal acknowledgement of papal authority while maintaining practical autonomy over Serbian religious affairs. The coronation ceremony that took place in 1217 marked a revolutionary moment in Serbian history. Stefan became the first Serbian ruler to receive the formal title of king, elevating Serbia from a principality to a kingdom in the eyes of medieval Europe. The papal legate who performed the ceremony represented the highest authority in Western Christendom, ensuring that Serbian royal status would be recognized by all Catholic kingdoms. Most importantly, the coronation established a precedent that would be followed by Stefan's successors, creating a hereditary royal dynasty that would rule Serbia for the next century and a half. However, Stefan understood that political independence alone would not be sufficient to guarantee Serbia's long-term sovereignty. Religious autonomy was equally important in a medieval world where political and ecclesiastical authority were closely intertwined. The Serbian Orthodox Church remained subordinate to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, creating potential for Byzantine interference in Serbian internal affairs through ecclesiastical channels. The solution to this problem came through the remarkable achievements of Stefan's younger brother Rastko, who had chosen the monastic life and taken the religious name Sava. Unlike his brothers, who focused on political and military affairs, Sava dedicated himself to theological study and ecclesiastical diplomacy. His deep learning and evident piety had earned him recognition throughout the Orthodox world, creating opportunities for advancing Serbian ecclesiastical interests that would have been impossible for secular rulers to achieve. Sava's negotiations with the Byzantine Patriarch resulted in the establishment of an autocephalous Serbian Orthodox Church in 1219, making Serbia one of the few Orthodox countries to achieve complete ecclesiastical independence. This achievement was even more remarkable because it occurred during a period when the Byzantine Empire was weakened by the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, but still maintained authority over most Orthodox churches. Sava's success reflected both his diplomatic skills and the respect that his scholarship and piety had earned throughout the Orthodox world. The creation of the autocephalous Serbian Church was accompanied by Sava's composition of the Nomocanon, the first written legal code in Serbian history. This document combined civil law based on Roman legal traditions with canon law derived from Orthodox ecclesiastical practice. The Nomocanon established legal frameworks for both secular and religious governance, while ensuring that Serbian law reflected the specific needs and traditions of the Serbian people rather than simply adapting foreign legal systems. The coronation ceremony that took place at Žiča Monastery in 1220 represented the culmination of the political and religious revolution that Stefan and Sava had achieved. For the first time in Serbian history, a Serbian king was crowned by a Serbian archbishop in a Serbian monastery according to Orthodox ritual. This ceremony symbolized the complete independence that Serbia had achieved, political sovereignty recognized by the West, and religious autonomy acknowledged by the East. The death of King Stefan the First-Crowned in 1228 marked the end of Serbia's founding era and the beginning of a new phase focused on consolidating the achievements of the previous generation. The kingdom that Stefan's successors inherited possessed the institutional framework necessary for sustained growth, but it remained a relatively modest state that controlled only the core Serbian territories. Over the next half-century, 3 successive kings would transform this foundation into a dynamic medieval kingdom capable of challenging the established powers of southeastern Europe. The succession of Stefan Radoslav, the eldest son of Stefan the First-Crowned, initially appeared to threaten the stability that the kingdom had achieved. Unlike his father, who had successfully balanced competing foreign influences while maintaining Serbian independence, Radoslav pursued a foreign policy that aligned Serbia closely with the Byzantine Empire. This orientation reflected both his personal inclinations and the influence of his Byzantine wife, but it created tensions with powerful Serbian nobles who preferred the more autonomous approach that his father had developed. Radoslav's pro-Byzantine policies extended beyond simple diplomatic alignment to include cultural and religious initiatives that seemed to threaten Serbian independence. He invited Byzantine scholars and artists to his court, promoted Greek language and customs among the Serbian nobility, and appeared willing to subordinate Serbian interests to imperial policy. Most controversially, he seemed prepared to compromise the autonomy of the Serbian Orthodox Church that Saint Sava had worked so hard to establish. The resistance that emerged against Radoslav's policies demonstrated the strength of the Serbian national consciousness that had developed during the previous century. Serbian nobles who had supported his father's more independent approach began to organize opposition to what they perceived as a betrayal of Serbian sovereignty. The Orthodox Church, led by Archbishop Arsenia I, became a center of resistance to policies that threatened to undermine ecclesiastical independence. Most importantly, popular sentiment increasingly favored maintaining the distinctive Serbian identity that had emerged under Nemanjić rule. The crisis came to a head in 1234, when a coalition of nobles, supported by Hungarian intervention, overthrew Radoslav and replaced him with his younger brother Stefan Vladislav. This change of rulers represented more than a simple palace coup. It was a rejection of the pro-Byzantine orientation that had characterized Radoslav's reign and a return to the more balanced foreign policy that had served Serbia successfully under Stefan the First-Crowned. Stefan Vladislav's reign from 1234 to 1243 was marked by efforts to repair the damage that the previous period had inflicted on Serbian independence and unity. His first priority was restoring the autonomy of Serbian institutions that his brother had compromised. The Serbian Orthodox Church regained its independence from Byzantine interference, while the royal administration was restructured to eliminate officials who had been appointed based on their loyalty to Constantinople rather than their service to Serbian interests. Vladislav also initiated the first significant territorial expansion beyond the core Serbian lands that his grandfather Stefan Nemanja had unified. His campaigns against Byzantine territories in the south brought several important towns and their surrounding regions under Serbian control. These conquests were significant not only for the additional territory and population they provided, but also for the precedent they established. For the first time since achieving independence, Serbia was expanding at the expense of major neighboring powers rather than simply defending its existing borders. The economic benefits of territorial expansion became apparent during Vladislav's reign as new tax revenues and trade opportunities strengthened the royal treasury. The captured territories included several important mining regions that provided silver and other metals crucial for medieval state finances. Additionally, control over new trade routes allowed Serbian merchants to participate more actively in the commercial networks that connected Central Europe with the Mediterranean world. Cultural development during Vladislav's reign reflected the growing confidence and sophistication of Serbian society. The king commissioned the construction of several important monasteries that became centers of learning and artistic achievement. Serbian craftsmen began producing works that combined traditional motifs with techniques learned from both Byzantine and Western European sources. Most importantly, a distinctively Serbian literary tradition began to emerge as scholars and monks produced historical chronicles and religious texts in the Serbian language. However, the most transformative reign of this period belonged to Stefan Uroš I, who succeeded his brother Vladislav in 1243 and ruled for the next 33 years. Uroš inherited a kingdom that had recovered from the instability of the 1230s and was ready for more ambitious expansion. His reign would see Serbia emerge as a significant regional power capable of influencing events throughout southeastern Europe. The cornerstone of Uroš's success was his marriage to Helen of Anjou, a member of one of the most powerful noble families in Western Europe. This union represented a diplomatic triumph that elevated Serbia's international status far beyond what its size and resources alone would have warranted. The House of Anjou controlled territories stretching from southern Italy to Hungary, and Helen's marriage to the Serbian king created family connections that would prove invaluable in Serbian diplomacy for generations. Helen of Anjou brought more than diplomatic connections to her marriage. She also introduced Western European cultural influences that enriched Serbian civilization. Her court became a center where Serbian traditions merged with French and Italian customs, creating a sophisticated cultural synthesis that reflected Serbia's unique position between Eastern and Western Europe. The Queen's patronage supported artists, scholars, and architects who produced works of exceptional quality that demonstrated Serbian cultural achievement to foreign visitors. The territorial expansion that characterized Uroš's reign was more systematic and extensive than the opportunistic conquests of his predecessors. Rather than simply taking advantage of temporary Byzantine weakness, Uroš developed a comprehensive strategy for expanding Serbian influence throughout the Balkans. His campaigns were carefully planned military operations, supported by diplomatic initiatives designed to isolate his enemies and secure his conquests. The most significant of these expansions occurred in the region of Macedonia, where Uroš successfully captured several important cities including Skopje and Prilep. These conquests brought wealthy urban centers under Serbian control, while also providing access to the major trade routes that connected Constantinople with the Adriatic Sea. The economic benefits of controlling these commercial networks provided resources that funded further military expansion and supported the increasingly elaborate royal court. Uroš's administrative innovations during this period laid the foundation for the more centralized state that his successors would inherit. He established a system of appointed governors who answered directly to the king, rather than ruling as autonomous regional lords. Professional administrators replaced the informal household officials who had previously managed royal business. Most importantly, regular taxation systems were implemented that provided predictable revenues for government operations and military campaigns. The legal developments that occurred during Uroš's reign built upon the foundation that Saint Sava had established with his Nomocanon. New legal codes were developed that addressed the specific needs of an expanding kingdom with an increasingly diverse population. Commercial law was standardized to facilitate trade across Serbian territories. Criminal law was codified to ensure consistent justice throughout the kingdom. These legal innovations demonstrated the institutional sophistication that Serbia had achieved and provided models that would influence legal development throughout the region. Cultural achievements during Uroš's reign reflected the prosperity and confidence that territorial expansion had brought to the Serbian kingdom. The construction of Sopoćani Monastery, one of the masterpieces of medieval Serbian architecture, symbolized the artistic heights that Serbian culture had reached. The monastery's frescoes combined traditional Orthodox themes with innovative artistic techniques that influenced religious art throughout the Balkans. The monastery also served as a center for manuscript production that preserved and transmitted Serbian literary traditions. The economic prosperity that characterized Uroš's reign was built on more than military conquest and territorial expansion. Agricultural improvements increased food production and supported population growth. Urban centers expanded as craftsmen and merchants established permanent workshops and trading houses. Mining operations were modernized using techniques learned from Western European experts, increasing the production of silver and other metals that provided the basis for Serbian currency and international trade. Military innovations during this period prepared Serbia for the even more ambitious expansions that would characterize the next phase of its development. Professional military units were established that could campaign year-round rather than relying on seasonal levies of peasant soldiers. Fortification techniques were improved using knowledge gained from captured Byzantine and Western European military engineers. Most importantly, a sophisticated intelligence network was developed that provided information about enemy activities and potential opportunities for expansion. The diplomatic achievements of Uroš's reign extended far beyond his marriage alliance with the House of Anjou. Treaties were negotiated with Venice that secured favorable terms for Serbian merchants operating in Adriatic ports. Agreements with Hungarian kings established clear boundaries and mutual defense arrangements. Most significantly, relationships were maintained with both Byzantine and Western European powers that allowed Serbia to avoid the fate of smaller states that were absorbed by their more powerful neighbors. The year 1282 marked an unexpected turning point in Serbian royal succession that would fundamentally alter the structure of the Serbian state for the next generation. King Stefan Dragutin, who had inherited the throne from his father Stefan Uroš I just 6 years earlier, made a decision that shocked the medieval world. He voluntarily abdicated his crown in favor of his younger brother Stefan Milutin. This unprecedented act was precipitated by a hunting accident that left Dragutin partially disabled, but the consequences of his abdication would extend far beyond personal circumstances to create a unique political arrangement that would expand Serbian influence into entirely new territories. The abdication ceremony that took place at the Assembly of Dejeva represented more than a simple transfer of power between brothers. Dragutin's decision to step down voluntarily established a precedent that demonstrated the institutional maturity of the Serbian kingdom. Rather than clinging to power despite his physical limitations or allowing succession disputes to weaken the state, Dragutin chose to ensure continuity of strong leadership while negotiating terms that would secure his own future and that of his family. This arrangement reflected the sophisticated political culture that had developed within the Nemanjić dynasty over the previous century. The terms of Dragutin's abdication were carefully negotiated to prevent the kind of fraternal conflict that had devastated Serbia during the reign of Stefan the First-Crowned. Rather than retiring to a monastery as his great-grandfather Stefan Nemanja had done, Dragutin retained significant territorial holdings and political authority. He maintained control over northern Serbian territories along the Hungarian border, regions that had been incorporated into the kingdom during his father's expansions, but remained culturally and economically distinct from the core Serbian lands around Raška. The Hungarian dimension of Dragutin's post-abdication career proved to be the most significant aspect of this unusual arrangement. King Ladislaus IV of Hungary, seeking to extend Hungarian influence southward while rewarding a valuable ally, granted Dragutin substantial territorial concessions that transformed him from an abdicated Serbian king into the ruler of an entirely new kingdom. These Hungarian grants included the strategically crucial region of Machva, portions of northeastern Bosnia, and, most importantly, the fortress city of Belgrade, which commanded the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers. The establishment of what came to be known as the Kingdom of Sirmia represented a revolutionary development in Serbian political organization. For the first time in their history, Serbian rulers controlled territories that extended significantly northward into the Pannonian Plain, bringing them into direct contact with the emerging political dynamics of Central Europe. The kingdom that Dragutin established was neither a Hungarian vassal state nor an autonomous Serbian principality, but something entirely new. A Serbian kingdom operating within the Hungarian sphere of influence while maintaining its distinctive identity and institutions. Belgrade's incorporation into Serbian political control for the first time in history cannot be overstated in its significance for long-term Serbian development. The city occupied one of the most strategically important positions in southeastern Europe, controlling river traffic on both the Danube and the Sava, while serving as a gateway between the Balkan Peninsula and the vast territories of Central and Eastern Europe. Previous Serbian rulers had focused their attention on the mountainous interior and the Adriatic coast, but Dragutin's acquisition of Belgrade oriented Serbian strategic thinking toward the great river systems that connected the Balkans with the wider European continent. The administrative challenge of governing territories that were geographically separated from the traditional Serbian heartland required innovative approaches to medieval statecraft. Dragutin could not simply extend the governmental systems that had been developed in Raška to territories with different economic foundations, ethnic compositions, and strategic requirements. Instead, he created a hybrid administrative structure that combined Serbian royal traditions with Hungarian noble practices and local customary law. The economic opportunities that Dragutin's new territories provided were as significant as their strategic value. The fertile plains of Machva supported agricultural production that was both more intensive and more commercially oriented than the mountain farming that characterized traditional Serbian territories. The Danube River provided access to trade networks that extended from the Black Sea to Bavaria, creating commercial opportunities that had never been available to previous Serbian rulers. Most importantly, control over river crossings and trade routes generated customs revenues that provided independent financial resources for Dragutin's administration. The relationship between the two Serbian kingdoms that emerged after 1282 was complex and constantly evolving. Dragutin and Milutin maintained fraternal bonds while pursuing policies that sometimes conflicted with each other's interests. Both brothers recognized that Serbian strength depended ultimately on coordination between their territories, but they also competed for influence with foreign powers and occasionally pursued contradictory diplomatic initiatives. This dynamic created both opportunities and challenges that would shape Serbian development for the next 3 decades. Dragutin's kingdom served as a crucial buffer zone that protected the core Serbian territories from Hungarian pressure while providing opportunities for Serbian expansion into regions that had never been under Slavic control. His military campaigns in the Danube region brought additional territories under Serbian authority and demonstrated that Serbian military capabilities were not limited to the mountainous terrain where they had traditionally operated. These northern conquests also provided Dragutin with the resources and strategic depth necessary to maintain his independence from both Hungarian and Byzantine interference. The cultural synthesis that emerged in Dragutin's territories reflected the unique position of the Kingdom of Sirmia between different European civilization zones. Serbian Orthodox religious traditions were maintained and strengthened through the construction of new monasteries and churches, but they coexisted with Catholic influences that reflected the kingdom's position within the Hungarian sphere. This religious diversity created opportunities for cultural exchange while also requiring careful management to prevent sectarian conflicts that could undermine political stability. Military innovations that Dragutin implemented in his territories would prove influential for later Serbian development. The flat terrain of the Pannonian Plain required different tactical approaches than the mountainous battlefields where Serbian forces had traditionally operated. Dragutin's armies developed new cavalry techniques and siege warfare capabilities that enabled them to compete effectively with Hungarian and other Central European military forces. These innovations were gradually adopted by Serbian forces in other territories, contributing to the overall improvement of Serbian military effectiveness. The diplomatic implications of having 2 Serbian kingdoms operating simultaneously were both beneficial and problematic for long-term Serbian interests. On the positive side, the division allowed Serbian rulers to maintain relationships with competing foreign powers without forcing either kingdom to choose sides definitively. Dragutin could align his policies with Hungarian interests, while Milutin pursued closer relationships with Byzantium or other powers. However, this arrangement also created opportunities for foreign manipulation, as competing powers could attempt to play one Serbian kingdom against the other. Trade relations between the two kingdoms developed into sophisticated commercial networks that benefited both territories. Goods produced in the mountainous regions of Milutin's kingdom could be exported through the river systems that Dragutin controlled, while products from Central Europe could be imported through Belgrade and distributed throughout the Balkans. This commercial integration helped maintain unity between the two kingdoms despite their political separation and provided economic incentives for continued cooperation. The succession arrangements that Dragutin established for his kingdom demonstrated his understanding of the long-term challenges involved in maintaining Serbian control over territories that were geographically separated from the traditional power centers. Rather than simply assuming that his descendants would automatically inherit his Hungarian-granted territories, he negotiated specific agreements that guaranteed succession rights while defining the obligations that future rulers would have toward both Hungarian and Serbian authorities. When Dragutin died in 1316, after 34 years of ruling his northern kingdom, he left behind a remarkable legacy that had fundamentally altered the scope and character of Serbian political authority. His son, Vladislav II, who inherited the Kingdom of Sirmia, faced the challenge of maintaining the complex arrangements that his father had created while adapting to changing political circumstances in both Hungary and Serbia. The kingdom that Vladislav inherited controlled territories that had become integral to Serbian strategic and economic interests. But maintaining control over them required constant attention to the shifting balance of power in Central Europe. When Stefan Milutin assumed the Serbian throne in 1282, following his brother's voluntary abdication, he inherited a kingdom that possessed unprecedented opportunities for expansion and consolidation. The division of Serbian territories between himself and Stefan Dragutin had initially seemed to weaken Serbian power, but it soon became apparent that this arrangement had actually provided the kingdom with strategic flexibility and diverse resources that would enable the most ambitious phase of expansion in Serbian history. Over the next 39 years, Milutin would transform Serbia from a regional Balkan power into one of the wealthiest and most influential kingdoms in medieval Europe. Milutin's approach to kingship differed fundamentally from that of his predecessors, who had focused primarily on territorial expansion and military conquest. While he certainly pursued aggressive expansion policies, Milutin understood that lasting power required more than military success. It demanded the creation of institutional frameworks, economic systems, and cultural achievements that would survive political changes and external pressures. His reign would be remembered not only for the territories he conquered, but for the sophisticated civilization he created within those territories. The economic foundation of Milutin's success was built on his revolutionary approach to managing Serbia's natural resources, particularly the silver mines that had become increasingly important sources of royal revenue. Rather than simply extracting wealth to fund military campaigns, Milutin invested heavily in mining technology and infrastructure that increased production while providing employment for growing urban populations. He recruited German Saxon miners, whose expertise in extraction and processing techniques transformed Serbian mining from a primitive operation into one of the most advanced in Europe. The wealth generated by these improved mining operations provided Milutin with financial resources that far exceeded those available to previous Serbian rulers. The royal treasury accumulated silver reserves that enabled the kingdom to maintain professional military forces, support extensive diplomatic activities, and fund the massive construction projects that would become the most visible symbols of Milutin's reign. More importantly, this wealth gave Serbia the economic independence necessary to pursue policies based on Serbian interests, rather than the demands of foreign creditors or allies. Milutin's military campaigns during the first 2 decades of his reign extended Serbian territory in all directions, creating an empire that stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Black Sea approaches. His conquest of substantial portions of Macedonia brought the wealthy commercial centers of Ohrid and Prilep under Serbian control, while his campaigns in Albania secured access to important Adriatic ports. Most significantly, his expansion into Byzantine territories demonstrated that Serbia had become powerful enough to challenge the Eastern Empire on equal terms rather than simply defending against imperial expansion. The strategic importance of these conquests extended far beyond their immediate territorial value. Control over Macedonian territories gave Serbia access to the ancient trade routes that connected Constantinople with the Adriatic, providing customs revenues and commercial opportunities that had previously been monopolized by Byzantine merchants. The Albanian conquests secured Serbia's western flank while providing access to Mediterranean trade networks that connected the Balkans with Italy and beyond. Most importantly, these expanded territories provided the human and material resources necessary to support even more ambitious expansion in the future. However, Milutin's most significant achievement was his recognition that unlimited expansion could ultimately weaken rather than strengthen the Serbian state. In 1299, at the height of his military success, he made the remarkable decision to halt further territorial expansion and focus instead on consolidating the territories he had already conquered. This decision reflected a sophisticated understanding of the limits of medieval statecraft and the dangers inherent in governing territories that were too large or diverse to be effectively administered. The consolidation policy that Milutin implemented after 1299 involved a comprehensive restructuring of Serbian governmental, military, and religious institutions. Rather than governing his expanded territories as a collection of conquered provinces, he developed integrated administrative systems that provided uniform law enforcement, taxation, and military service throughout the kingdom. This approach required the creation of new governmental institutions that could coordinate activities across vast distances while maintaining central authority over local officials. The religious dimension of Milutin's consolidation efforts proved to be particularly significant for long-term Serbian development. His decision to move the seat of the Serbian archbishopric from Žiča to Peć in 1299 reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. Peč's location in the Kosovo region placed the ecclesiastical capital closer to the geographic center of the expanded kingdom, while also emphasizing Serbian control over territories that had been the heart of medieval Kosovo's prosperity. The move also demonstrated the autonomous character of the Serbian Church, which could relocate its headquarters based on Serbian rather than foreign considerations. Milutin's building program during the consolidation period created architectural monuments that would remain symbols of Serbian cultural achievement for centuries. The construction of Gračanica Monastery represented the pinnacle of Serbian medieval architecture, combining traditional Orthodox design principles with innovative artistic elements that reflected the cultural synthesis Milutin had fostered throughout his kingdom. The monastery served not only as a religious center, but as a statement of Serbian cultural sophistication that demonstrated the kingdom's capacity to create works of lasting beauty and spiritual significance. The diplomatic revolution that Milutin achieved through his marriage policies demonstrated his understanding that military conquest alone could not guarantee lasting security for an expanded Serbian state. His marriage to Simonida, the daughter of Byzantine Emperor Andronikos II, represented more than a simple alliance. It symbolized Serbia's emergence as a power that could negotiate with Byzantium on equal terms rather than as a subordinate client state. The marriage negotiations required complex diplomatic maneuvering that balanced Serbian independence with Byzantine prestige, ultimately creating a relationship that benefited both parties. The peace settlement with Byzantium that accompanied Milutin's marriage to Simonida in 1299 provided Serbia with the security necessary to focus on internal development rather than constant warfare. The agreement recognized Serbian control over the territories that Milutin had conquered while establishing clear boundaries that reduced the potential for future conflicts. Most importantly, the settlement allowed both kingdoms to concentrate their resources on other challenges, particularly the growing Ottoman threat that was beginning to emerge in Asia Minor. Milutin's cultural patronage during the final 2 decades of his reign created a golden age of Serbian artistic and intellectual achievement that elevated the kingdom's reputation throughout Europe. The royal court became a center of learning where Serbian scholars worked alongside Byzantine intellectuals and Western European visitors to create new forms of literature, art, and scholarship. The monastery schools that Milutin established throughout his territories preserved and transmitted both religious and secular knowledge while training the educated administrators necessary for governing an expanded state. The economic prosperity that characterized the later years of Milutin's reign was built on more than mining revenues and territorial expansion. Agricultural improvements increased food production throughout the kingdom, supporting population growth and urbanization. Commercial networks developed that connected Serbian merchants with trading partners throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Most importantly, a stable currency system was established that facilitated both internal commerce and international trade. Military innovations during Milutin's reign prepared Serbia for the challenges that would face his successors. Professional military units were expanded and equipped with the most advanced weapons available in medieval Europe. Fortification techniques were improved using knowledge gained from captured Byzantine and Western military engineers. Intelligence networks were developed that provided information about potential threats and opportunities throughout the region. The administrative systems that Milutin created during his consolidation period provided the institutional foundation that would enable his successors to govern the expanded Serbian state effectively. Professional bureaucracies replaced the informal household administrations that had characterized earlier Serbian kingdoms. Legal codes were standardized throughout the kingdom, ensuring consistent justice regardless of local traditions or customs. Tax collection systems were regularized to provide predictable revenues for governmental operations. The succession arrangements that Milutin established during his final years reflected his understanding of the challenges involved in transferring power in an expanded medieval state. Rather than simply designating an heir and hoping for the best, he carefully prepared his son, Stefan Dušan, for the responsibilities of kingship while ensuring that the governmental institutions he had created would survive the transition. The arrangements he made would prove crucial for maintaining Serbian unity during the succession crisis that would follow his death. The succession of Stefan Dušan to the Serbian throne in 1321 appeared to promise continuity with the brilliant achievements of his father Milutin's reign. However, beneath the surface of this apparently smooth transition lay deep personal and political tensions that would define one of the most turbulent decades in Serbian history. Dušan's path to power had been marked by conflict, exile, and reconciliation, experiences that would profoundly shape his approach to kingship and ultimately set the stage for the empire-building ambitions of his own son. The relationship between Stefan Dušan and his father had been complicated from the beginning by the unusual circumstances of Milutin's marriage policies. As part of his diplomatic strategy, Milutin had contracted multiple marriages throughout his reign, creating a complex web of family relationships that would have significant political consequences. Dušan was the son of Milutin's first wife, but his status as heir apparent had been challenged by the children of subsequent marriages, particularly those born to Simonida, the Byzantine princess whose marriage to Milutin had sealed the peace with Constantinople. The civil war that erupted between father and son around 1314 represented more than a simple succession dispute. It reflected fundamental disagreements about Serbia's future direction and foreign policy orientation. Dušan had advocated for a more aggressive expansion policy that would challenge Byzantine territorial holdings in the south, while Milutin preferred to maintain the peaceful relationships that had enabled his consolidation efforts. These policy differences were complicated by personal resentments and the influence of various noble factions who saw opportunity in royal family divisions. The conflict that developed between Dušan and his father followed patterns that had become tragically familiar in Serbian royal history. Military campaigns devastated portions of the kingdom as both sides attempted to secure territorial bases for their competing claims. Foreign powers intervened to support their preferred candidates, with Byzantium naturally favoring Milutin's more conciliatory approach, while other regional powers saw opportunities to advance their own interests through support for the rebellious son. Dušan's eventual defeat and exile to Constantinople in 1316 marked one of the lowest points in his career, but it also provided him with invaluable experience that would prove crucial during his later reign. His 7 years at the Byzantine court exposed him to the sophisticated administrative methods and diplomatic practices that had enabled the Eastern Empire to survive for over a millennium. More importantly, his time in Constantinople gave him detailed knowledge of Byzantine weaknesses and internal divisions that he would later exploit with devastating effectiveness. The reconciliation between father and son that occurred around 1320 demonstrated both the personal bonds that ultimately transcended political differences and the pragmatic recognition that Serbian unity was essential for maintaining independence against external threats. Milutin's decision to restore Dušanski to his position as heir reflected his understanding that the kingdom's future required strong leadership, while Dušanski's acceptance of his father's terms showed his willingness to subordinate personal ambitions to Serbian interests. When Dušanski finally inherited the throne upon his father's death in 1321, he faced the challenge of governing a kingdom that had been weakened by years of internal conflict while also managing the rising expectations of nobles and generals who anticipated aggressive expansion under the new ruler. The kingdom that he inherited was fundamentally sound. Milutin's consolidation efforts had created effective administrative and military institutions, but it required dynamic leadership to realize its potential for further growth. The early years of Dušanski's reign were marked by careful preparation for the military campaigns that he had long advocated. Rather than launching immediate attacks against neighboring territories, he spent several years strengthening Serbian military capabilities and building the diplomatic alliances necessary for successful expansion. This methodical approach reflected lessons learned during his years of conflict with his father about the importance of thorough preparation for major strategic initiatives. The opportunity for which Dušanski had been preparing came in 1330, when the Second Bulgarian Empire became embroiled in a succession crisis that provided Serbia with the chance to settle old scores and gain significant territorial advantages. The Bulgarian Empire under Michael Asen III had been experiencing internal instability that weakened its capacity to defend its western territories, creating an opening that Serbian military planners had been anticipating for years. The Battle of Velbujd, fought on July 28, 1330, represented the culmination of Dušanski's military preparations and strategic planning. The Serbian army that took the field against the Bulgarians was the most professional and well-equipped force that any Serbian ruler had ever commanded. Years of military reform had created units that combined traditional Serbian fighting capabilities with advanced tactical methods learned from both Byzantine and Western European sources. Stefan Dušanski's personal leadership during the battle demonstrated his transformation from a rebellious prince into a capable military commander. Despite being physically handicapped, he suffered from a leg injury that gave him his name Dušanski, meaning of Dušani. He commanded his forces with skill and courage that inspired his troops and intimidated his enemies. His strategic decisions during the battle showed sophisticated understanding of terrain, timing, and tactical coordination. The victory at Velbujd was complete and decisive, effectively ending Bulgarian power as a major factor in Balkan politics for the next several decades. The Bulgarian army was destroyed, Emperor Michael Asen was killed, and vast territories in eastern Macedonia and western Bulgaria fell under Serbian control. More importantly, the victory demonstrated that Serbia had become the dominant military power in southeastern Europe, capable of defeating any neighboring state in direct confrontation. The territorial gains that resulted from the Velbujd victory transformed Serbia's strategic position fundamentally. Control over eastern Macedonian territories provided access to important trade routes and urban centers that had previously been beyond Serbian reach. The expansion into Bulgarian territories brought significant Slavic populations under Serbian rule, strengthening the kingdom's demographic base while providing additional military manpower for future campaigns. However, perhaps the most significant consequence of the victory was its impact on Serbian national confidence and imperial ambitions. The complete defeat of Bulgaria, which had been a major regional power for centuries, demonstrated that Serbian military capabilities were sufficient to challenge even the most established Balkan kingdoms. This realization would prove crucial in shaping the imperial ambitions that would characterize the next phase of Serbian expansion under Dušanski's son. The construction project that would become Dušanski's most enduring legacy began shortly after his military triumph at Velbujd. The monastery of Visoki Dečani, built in the Kosovo region between 1327 and 1335, represented both a personal monument to the king's piety and a symbol of Serbian cultural achievement. The monastery's architecture combined traditional Serbian Orthodox design elements with innovative techniques that reflected the kingdom's growing sophistication and wealth. Visoki Dečani was more than simply another royal monastery. It was a statement of Serbian cultural independence and artistic capability that was intended to impress both domestic and foreign audiences. The monastery's location in Kosovo emphasized Serbian control over the region's rich agricultural and mineral resources, while its architectural sophistication demonstrated that Serbian artists and builders could create works that rivaled the greatest achievements of Byzantine or Western European culture. The economic prosperity that characterized the later years of Dečanski's reign was built on the foundation of his military successes and the territorial expansion they had achieved. The wealth generated by control over new mining regions and trade routes provided resources for both military expansion and cultural development. Urban centers throughout the kingdom experienced growth as increased commercial activity supported larger populations of craftsmen and merchants. However, despite his military and cultural achievements, Dečanski's reign was increasingly troubled by tensions with his son Stefan Dušan, who had emerged as the leader of a faction of nobles who favored even more aggressive expansion policies. These younger nobles argued that Serbia's military successes demonstrated the kingdom's capacity to challenge not only regional powers like Bulgaria, but also major empires like Byzantium itself. They viewed Dečanski's more cautious approach as a missed opportunity to achieve even greater territorial gains. The generational conflict that developed between Dečanski and his son reflected broader debates within Serbian society about the kingdom's ultimate objectives and the risks associated with unlimited expansion. Dečanski's experience of civil war and exile had taught him the importance of consolidating gains before pursuing new conquests, while Dušan and his supporters believed that momentum from recent victories should be exploited immediately for maximum advantage. The crisis came to a head in 1331 when Dušan launched a coup that overthrew his father and assumed royal authority for himself. The deposition of Stefan Dečanski represented more than a simple change of rulers. It marked the triumph of the expansionist faction within Serbian politics and the beginning of the most ambitious phase of territorial expansion in Serbian history. The coup that brought Stefan Dušan to power in 1331 marked the beginning of the most extraordinary phase of expansion in Serbian history. At 23 years old, the new king possessed a combination of military genius, political vision, and ruthless ambition that would transform Serbia from a regional Balkan kingdom into an empire that controlled half of southeastern Europe. The 15 years between his seizure of power and his imperial coronation would witness territorial conquests on a scale that medieval Europe had rarely seen, as Dušan systematically dismantled Byzantine power while constructing the largest Serbian state in history. The circumstances that enabled Dušan's remarkable expansion were rooted in the catastrophic decline of the Byzantine Empire during the early 14th century. The empire that had once dominated the eastern Mediterranean was now torn apart by a series of civil wars that had devastated its military capabilities and bankrupted its treasury. The conflict between Emperor Andronikos III and his grandfather Andronikos II had divided the empire's remaining territories between competing factions, creating opportunities for external enemies that had not existed since the darkest days of the 7th century. Dušan's strategic genius lay in his recognition that Byzantine weakness was not a temporary condition that might be reversed by a change of rulers, but a fundamental collapse that provided a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Serbian expansion. Where his father Dečanski had been content to exploit Bulgarian weakness for limited territorial gains, Dušan understood that the disintegration of Byzantium offered the possibility of creating a Serbian empire that could claim succession to the Eastern Roman tradition itself. The first phase of Dušan's expansion began immediately after his assumption of power with a systematic campaign to conquer the remaining Byzantine territories in Macedonia. These lands had been the economic heartland of the medieval Byzantine Empire, containing wealthy cities, productive agricultural regions, and crucial trade routes that connected Constantinople with the Western Balkans. Dušan's conquest of these territories between 1331 and 1334 provided Serbia with both the economic resources and the strategic position necessary for even more ambitious expansion. The siege and capture of Ohrid in 1334 represented a symbolic as well as strategic triumph for Serbian arms. The city had been one of the most important ecclesiastical centers in the Orthodox world, serving as the seat of an archbishopric that traced its origins to the earliest days of Christianity in the Balkans. Dušan's control over Ohrid provided legitimacy for his later claims to imperial status, while also demonstrating Serbian capacity to govern complex urban centers with diverse religious and ethnic populations. The Albanian campaigns that Dušan launched between 1334 and 1337 brought the entire Albanian coastline under Serbian control, giving the kingdom direct access to the Adriatic Sea along a front that stretched from Montenegro to southern Albania. These conquests were particularly significant because they provided Serbia with naval capabilities that had never existed under previous rulers. Control over Albanian ports enabled Serbian merchants to participate directly in Mediterranean trade, while also providing strategic bases for potential amphibious operations against Byzantine territories. The conquest of Albania also demonstrated Dušan's sophisticated understanding of medieval military logistics and strategy. The Albanian territories were mountainous and difficult to conquer, requiring sustained campaigns that tested Serbian military organization and supply capabilities. Dušan's success in these challenging conditions proved that Serbian forces had evolved far beyond the tribal militias of earlier centuries into professional armies capable of complex operations in diverse terrain. The most audacious phase of Dušan's expansion began in 1340 when he launched a massive offensive against the Byzantine heartland in Greece itself. This campaign represented a fundamental escalation in Serbian ambitions, as previous Serbian rulers had been content to conquer Slavic territories along the empire's northern frontier. Dušan's invasion of Greece demonstrated his intention to challenge Byzantium for control over the entire eastern Mediterranean region. The speed and completeness of Serbian success in Greece astonished contemporary observers throughout Europe. Within 3 years, Dušan's armies had conquered Epirus, Thessaly, and substantial portions of central Greece, bringing Serbian forces to within striking distance of Athens and the Peloponnese. The Byzantine Empire's inability to mount effective resistance to these conquests revealed the extent of imperial collapse while establishing Serbia as the dominant power in southeastern Europe. The city of Sarras, captured by Serbian forces in 1345, became Dušan's southern capital and the symbol of Serbian success in the former Byzantine heartland. The city's strategic location in eastern Macedonia made it an ideal base for further expansion toward Constantinople itself, while its wealth and commercial connections provided resources for the increasingly elaborate royal court that Dušan was establishing. The capture of Sarras also brought significant Greek populations under Serbian rule for the first time, creating administrative challenges that would require innovative approaches to governance. Dušan's treatment of conquered Greek territories demonstrated his understanding that successful empire building required more than military conquest. It demanded the creation of administrative systems that could integrate diverse populations while maintaining central control over vast distances. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Serbian institutions throughout his expanded territories, he developed a flexible approach that preserved local customs and religious practices while ensuring ultimate loyalty to Serbian royal authority. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied Dušan's military conquests was equally significant for Serbian imperial development. His alliance with the Bulgarian Empire, formalized through dynastic marriage connections, provided strategic security on Serbia's eastern frontier while enabling concentration of Serbian forces for campaigns against Byzantium. This alliance also demonstrated Dušan's ability to transform former enemies into partners through careful diplomacy and shared interests. The relationship that Dušan established with Venice during this period reflected his growing international stature and his understanding of the commercial dimensions of imperial power. Venetian merchants had traditionally relied on Byzantine protection for their trading activities in the eastern Mediterranean, but the empire's collapse forced them to seek new arrangements with emerging regional powers. Dušan's agreements with Venice provided Serbian territories with access to advanced commercial practices while securing Venetian support for his territorial claims. The ecclesiastical dimensions of Dušan's expansion proved to be as important as the military and diplomatic aspects. His conquest of territories that contained some of the most important Orthodox monasteries and churches in the Balkans provided him with religious authority that complemented his political power. The support that he received from Orthodox clergy in conquered territories legitimized Serbian rule while also providing administrative expertise that was crucial for governing diverse populations. The economic transformation that occurred during Dušan's expansion fundamentally altered the character of the Serbian state. The wealth generated by control over Greek commercial centers, Albanian ports, and Macedonian agricultural regions provided resources that far exceeded anything available to previous Serbian rulers. This prosperity supported not only military expansion, but also the cultural and architectural projects that would become symbols of Serbian imperial achievement. The administrative innovations that Dušan implemented to govern his expanded territories created the institutional framework necessary for managing a multi-ethnic empire. Professional bureaucracies were established that could coordinate activities across vast distances while maintaining uniform standards of justice and taxation. These institutional developments would prove crucial for the stability of the empire during both its peak years and its eventual decline. Military reforms during this period created the most effective fighting force in southeastern Europe. Professional units were expanded and equipped with the most advanced weapons available, while tactical innovations enabled Serbian forces to operate effectively in the diverse terrain that characterized their expanded territories. Intelligence networks were developed that provided detailed information about enemy capabilities and intentions throughout the region. By 1345, Stefan Dušan had achieved territorial conquests that placed him among the most powerful rulers in Europe. But he understood that military success alone was insufficient to establish lasting imperial authority. The transformation from a Balkan kingdom into a recognized empire required formal acts of legitimization that would command respect from both his own subjects and foreign powers. The elaborate preparations that Dušan undertook for his imperial coronation represented more than ceremonial pageantry. They constituted a carefully orchestrated political revolution designed to establish Serbia as the legitimate successor to the Byzantine Empire. The decision to proclaim himself emperor had been developing in Dušan's mind throughout his campaigns in Greece, where he had witnessed firsthand the complete collapse of Byzantine authority and the desperate pleas of Greek populations for stable governance. Unlike previous Serbian rulers who had been content to acknowledge Byzantine suzerainty even while conquering imperial territories, Dušan recognized that the empire's disintegration created a unique opportunity to claim the imperial succession for Serbia. This audacious ambition required careful preparation to ensure that his imperial claims would be accepted by both his existing subjects and the diverse populations he had recently conquered. The ecclesiastical preparations for the coronation proved to be among the most complex and significant aspects of the entire enterprise. The creation of an imperial title required more than simple self-proclamation. It demanded recognition from the highest religious authorities in the Orthodox world. Dušan's solution to this challenge demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of medieval political theology and his ability to manipulate competing ecclesiastical interests to achieve his objectives. The elevation of the Serbian archbishopric to the status of a patriarchate represented the crucial ecclesiastical foundation for imperial coronation. This transformation required negotiations with multiple Orthodox authorities, including the Bulgarian Patriarch and various Greek bishops who had come under Serbian control during the recent conquests. The complexity of these negotiations reflected the broader political implications of creating a new patriarchate, which would fundamentally alter the balance of ecclesiastical power in the Orthodox world. Patriarch Nemanjić II, who had been elevated to lead the newly created Serbian Patriarchate, played a crucial role in legitimizing Dušan's imperial ambitions. His previous experience as Archbishop of Peć had demonstrated his administrative capabilities and his loyalty to Serbian interests, making him an ideal candidate to lead the ecclesiastical transformation that imperial status required. The relationship between emperor and patriarch that was established during this period would become a model for church-state relations that would influence Serbian political development for centuries. The participation of the Bulgarian Patriarch Simeon in Dušan's coronation represented a diplomatic triumph that enhanced the legitimacy of the entire proceedings. Bulgaria's ecclesiastical recognition of Serbian imperial claims provided crucial Orthodox validation, while also demonstrating the regional support that Dušan had cultivated through his careful alliance policies. The Bulgarian Patriarch's presence at the coronation ceremony symbolized the broader realignment of Balkan politics that had resulted from Serbian territorial expansion. The choice of Skopje as the site for the imperial coronation carried profound symbolic significance that was not lost on contemporary observers. The city had been the capital of the medieval Bulgarian Empire during its period of greatest power, and its selection as the coronation site demonstrated Dušan's intention to claim succession not only to Byzantine authority, but to the entire tradition of Slavic imperial rule in the Balkans. The decision also reflected practical considerations, as Skopje's central location made it accessible to representatives from throughout the expanded Serbian territories. The coronation ceremony that took place on April 16, 1346, represented the culmination of months of preparation and the formal beginning of the Serbian Empire. The elaborate ritual that was performed combined traditional Orthodox coronation practices with innovative elements that reflected the unique character of Serbian imperial claims. The ceremony was designed to demonstrate both continuity with established imperial traditions and the distinctive Serbian identity that would characterize the new empire. The imperial title that Dušan assumed, Emperor of the Serbs and Greeks, represented a revolutionary departure from previous Serbian royal traditions. Earlier, Serbian rulers had been content to style themselves as kings of Serbia or kings of the Serbian lands, acknowledging their rule over a specifically Serbian population within defined territorial boundaries. Dušan's imperial title explicitly claimed authority over both Serbian and Greek populations, asserting his right to rule the diverse ethnic and religious communities that his conquests had brought under Serbian control. The dual nature of the imperial title also reflected Dušan's understanding of the political realities of governing an empire that included both Slavic and Greek populations, with different cultural traditions and historical loyalties. By explicitly acknowledging his Greek subjects in his imperial title, Dušan signaled his intention to govern them as legitimate imperial subjects rather than simply as conquered populations. This approach was crucial for maintaining stability in the diverse territories that comprised his empire. The administrative transformation that accompanied the imperial proclamation created new governmental institutions that were designed to manage the complex challenges of ruling a multi-ethnic empire. The imperial chancery that was established in Skopje became the central coordinating body for imperial administration, responsible for maintaining communication with provincial governors and ensuring uniform implementation of imperial policies throughout the expanded territories. The creation of new court offices and ceremonial positions reflected the elevated status that imperial rule required, while also providing opportunities for integrating noble families from conquered territories into the Serbian political system. Greek nobles who demonstrated loyalty to the new imperial regime were granted positions in the imperial administration, creating incentives for cooperation while also utilizing their expertise in governing Greek populations. The monetary reforms that were implemented following the imperial coronation demonstrated Dušan's understanding of the symbolic and practical importance of imperial regalia. New coins were minted that featured imperial titles and symbols, providing tangible evidence of the political transformation that had occurred while also facilitating commercial activities throughout the expanded empire. the standardization of currency across Serbian territories enhanced economic integration while also reinforcing imperial authority. The military implications of imperial status required significant organizational changes that reflected the expanded responsibilities and opportunities that accompanied Dušan's new title. Imperial armies were reorganized to include units drawn from throughout the empire's territories, creating integrated military forces that combined Serbian, Albanian, Greek, and Bulgarian soldiers under unified command structures. This military integration served both practical and political purposes, enhancing military effectiveness while also creating bonds of loyalty that transcended ethnic boundaries. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied Dušan's imperial coronation fundamentally altered Serbia's relationships with other European powers. The imperial title placed Serbia in direct competition with Byzantium for recognition as the legitimate successor to the Roman Empire in the East, creating diplomatic tensions that would influence Balkan politics for decades. However, the title also elevated Serbia's international status, making it a potential partner for Western European powers that were seeking allies against Ottoman expansion. The reaction of the Byzantine Empire to Dušan's imperial coronation was predictably hostile, as the surviving imperial government in Constantinople viewed the Serbian claims as both illegitimate usurpation and a direct threat to Byzantine survival. Emperor John VI Kantakouzenos denounced the Serbian coronation and attempted to organize international opposition to Dušan's imperial claims. However, the empire's weakness limited its capacity to take effective action against the Serbian fait accompli. The cultural implications of imperial status extended far beyond ceremonial and administrative changes to encompass fundamental transformations in Serbian artistic and intellectual life. The imperial court that was established in Skopje became a center of cultural synthesis where Serbian, Greek, and broader European traditions merged to create new forms of artistic expression. The patronage that Dušan provided for artists, scholars, and architects resulted in cultural achievements that demonstrated the sophistication and wealth of the new empire. The legal implications of imperial proclamation required the development of new legal frameworks that could govern the diverse populations and territories that comprised Dušan's empire. The existing Serbian legal traditions, while sophisticated, were designed for governing a relatively homogeneous population within clearly defined territorial boundaries. Imperial rule required legal systems that could accommodate different ethnic communities while maintaining central authority and uniform standards of justice. The proclamation of the Serbian Empire marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most productive and transformative decade in Serbian medieval history. With his imperial status secured and his territorial conquests largely complete, Stefan Dušan turned his attention to the monumental task of creating governmental, legal, and cultural institutions worthy of his vast empire. The 9 years between his coronation and his death would witness the creation of legal codes, administrative systems, and cultural achievements that would serve as the foundation for Serbian civilization long after the empire itself had disappeared. The most enduring legacy of Dušan's imperial reign was the comprehensive legal code that bears his name and represents one of the most sophisticated legislative achievements of medieval Europe. The creation of Dušan's code was not merely an administrative exercise, but a revolutionary attempt to create unified legal standards for an empire that encompassed dozens of different ethnic communities, religious traditions, and local customs. The complexity of this undertaking required years of careful preparation and consultation with legal experts from throughout the empire's territories. The first assembly that enacted portions of Dušan's code convened in Skopje on May 21, 1349, bringing together the most distinguished legal minds, religious authorities, and noble representatives from throughout the Serbian Empire. The assembly represented an unprecedented gathering of expertise and authority, including Serbian nobles who had governed under traditional customs, Greek administrators who understood Byzantine legal traditions, and church leaders who could ensure compatibility between secular and ecclesiastical law. The scope of the legal code that emerged from these deliberations was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. Unlike earlier medieval legal documents that typically addressed specific issues or conflicts, Dušan's code attempted to create a complete legal framework that could govern every aspect of life within the empire. The code addressed criminal law, civil disputes, commercial regulations, religious practices, administrative procedures, and social relationships with a thoroughness that had never been attempted in Serbian legal history. The criminal law provisions of the code reflected both the diverse challenges of governing a multi-ethnic empire and the sophisticated understanding of justice that characterized 14th-century Serbian legal thinking. Punishments were carefully calibrated to reflect both the severity of crimes and the social status of offenders, creating a hierarchical system of justice that maintained social order while providing protection for all imperial subjects. The code's treatment of theft, assault, murder, and treason demonstrated particular attention to the types of crimes that could threaten imperial stability. The commercial law sections of Dušan's code represented some of the most advanced economic legislation in medieval Europe. The empire's control over major trade routes between Central Europe and the Mediterranean had created complex commercial relationships that required sophisticated legal frameworks to govern. The code established uniform standards for weights, measures, and currency throughout the empire, while also providing legal protection for merchants and mechanisms for resolving commercial disputes. The agricultural provisions of the code addressed the fundamental economic relationships that supported the empire's prosperity. The majority of the empire's population consisted of peasant farmers whose labor provided the agricultural surplus necessary to support urban centers, military forces, and the imperial administration. The code established clear guidelines for landlord-tenant relationships, agricultural obligations, and the rights and duties of rural communities. The Second Assembly that completed Dušan's code convened in Ser in 1354, demonstrating the emperor's commitment to creating the most comprehensive legal framework possible. The 5-year interval between the two assemblies had provided time for testing the initial provisions and identifying areas that required additional legislation. The Seres Assembly addressed gaps in the original code while also updating provisions based on experience gained during their implementation. The religious law sections of the code reflected the central role that the Orthodox Church played in Serbian imperial ideology and governance. The code established the Serbian Patriarchate's authority over religious matters throughout the empire, while also defining the relationship between ecclesiastical and secular authority. These provisions were particularly important given the empire's religious diversity, which included not only Orthodox Christians but also Catholic populations in coastal regions and Muslim communities in some southern territories. The administrative innovations that accompanied the legal codification created governmental institutions capable of implementing uniform policies throughout the empire's vast territories. The imperial chancery in Skopje became the central coordinating body for imperial administration, maintaining correspondence with provincial governors and ensuring consistent implementation of imperial policies. Professional administrators replaced the informal household officials who had managed earlier Serbian governmental affairs. The provincial administration system that Dušan established represented a sophisticated approach to governing territories with different ethnic compositions and historical traditions. Rather than imposing uniform administrative structures throughout the empire, the system accommodated local variations while ensuring central coordination of military, fiscal, and judicial affairs. Provincial governors were granted considerable autonomy in managing local affairs while remaining accountable to imperial authority for maintaining order and collecting taxes. The judicial system that was created to implement Dušan's code established courts at multiple levels that could handle different types of cases and appeals. Local courts handled routine civil and criminal matters, while regional tribunals addressed more complex cases and appeals from lower courts. The imperial court in Skopje served as the final authority for the most serious cases and constitutional questions. This hierarchical system ensured that justice was accessible throughout the empire while maintaining uniform legal standards. The economic prosperity that characterized the empire during this period was built on more than territorial expansion and military conquest. Dušan's administrative reforms created stable conditions that encouraged commercial development and agricultural improvement. Trade networks flourished under imperial protection, connecting Serbian territories with markets throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Mining operations expanded to take advantage of the silver deposits that provided crucial resources for imperial finances. The cultural achievements of Dušan's reign represented the flowering of Serbian medieval civilization at its most sophisticated and confident. The imperial court became a center of learning where Serbian scholars worked alongside Greek intellectuals and visiting Western European experts to create new forms of literature, art, and scholarship. The synthesis of different cultural traditions that occurred during this period produced uniquely Serbian forms of expression that drew from the best of both Eastern and Western European civilization. The architectural projects that Dušan sponsored throughout his empire demonstrated both the wealth that imperial rule had generated and the sophisticated artistic vision that characterized Serbian culture at its peak. Churches and monasteries were constructed that combined traditional Orthodox architectural principles with innovative design elements that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout the empire. These buildings served not only as religious centers, but as symbols of Serbian cultural achievement that could impress both domestic and foreign visitors. The manuscript production that flourished during this period preserved and transmitted both religious and secular knowledge while also creating new forms of historical and literary expression. Serbian scriptoriums became centers for copying classical texts, while also producing original works that reflected contemporary Serbian concerns and achievements. The illuminated manuscripts created during this period represent some of the finest examples of medieval Serbian art. The military organization that supported the empire during its peak years represented the culmination of centuries of Serbian military development. Professional military units were equipped with the most advanced weapons available, while also maintaining the traditional fighting skills that had made Serbian armies so effective in earlier campaigns. The imperial military combined Serbian heavy cavalry with infantry units drawn from throughout the empire's territories, creating integrated forces that could operate effectively in diverse terrain and against different types of enemies. The diplomatic achievements of this period demonstrated the empire's emergence as a major factor in European politics. Dušan maintained relationships with powers throughout Europe while also managing the complex challenges of governing an empire that bordered on multiple competing interests. His diplomatic correspondence reveals sophisticated understanding of international politics and skilled maneuvering to maintain Serbian independence while maximizing opportunities for continued expansion. The religious developments that occurred during Dušan's imperial reign reflected both the emperor's personal piety and his understanding of the Orthodox Church's importance for maintaining imperial unity. New monasteries were established throughout the empire that served as centers of learning and spiritual life, while also demonstrating imperial patronage of religious institutions. The Serbian Patriarchate that had been established at his coronation developed into a sophisticated ecclesiastical organization that could coordinate religious affairs throughout the empire's diverse territories. By 1355, the Serbian Empire had reached the absolute pinnacle of its power and territorial extent. Stefan Dušan's realm stretched across more than half of the Balkan Peninsula, encompassing territories that would not again be united under a single ruler for over 5 centuries. The empire controlled the most prosperous regions of southeastern Europe, commanded the major trade routes between Central Europe and the Mediterranean, and possessed military forces that could challenge any contemporary power. Yet, at this moment of supreme achievement, new threats were emerging on the horizon that would test the empire's strength and unity in ways that its founder could scarcely have imagined. The territorial reach of Dušan's empire in 1355 represented an achievement unparalleled in Serbian history. From the Danube River in the north to the Gulf of Corinth in the south, From the Adriatic coastline in the west to the approaches of Constantinople in the east, Serbian authority extended over territories that encompassed modern-day Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Albania, parts of Greece, Bulgaria, and Bosnia. This vast domain contained some of the most economically valuable regions in Europe, including rich agricultural lands, productive mines, and bustling commercial centers. The economic prosperity that characterized the empire during this period was visible in every aspect of Serbian society. Urban centers throughout the empire experienced unprecedented growth as increased trade and imperial patronage supported larger populations of craftsmen, merchants, and scholars. The silver mines that had long been a source of Serbian wealth now produced revenues that enabled Dušan to maintain the most elaborate court in southeastern Europe, while also funding ambitious construction projects and military preparations. The cultural flowering that accompanied this economic prosperity demonstrated the sophistication that Serbian civilization had achieved under imperial rule. Artists, architects, and scholars from throughout Europe were drawn to Dušan's court, creating a cosmopolitan intellectual environment that produced works of lasting significance. The fusion of Serbian, Greek, and broader European cultural traditions that occurred during this period created uniquely Serbian forms of artistic expression that would influence Balkan culture for centuries. However, beneath the surface of this apparent prosperity and success, subtle signs of strain were beginning to appear that would prove crucial for the empire's future stability. The vast size of Dušan's territories created administrative challenges that even the sophisticated governmental systems he had developed could not entirely overcome. Communication between the imperial capital and distant provinces required weeks or months, making it difficult to coordinate policies or respond rapidly to local crises. The ethnic and religious diversity of the empire's population, while representing one of its greatest strengths, also created potential sources of instability that required constant attention from imperial administrators. Serbian nobles governed Greek populations who retained loyalty to Byzantine traditions. Orthodox clergy administered territories that included Catholic and Muslim communities. These complex relationships could be managed successfully during periods of strong central authority, but they also created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit during times of imperial weakness. The most ominous development during the final years of Dušan's reign was the emergence of a new threat that would ultimately prove more dangerous than any enemy the Serbs had previously faced. The Ottoman Turks, who had established themselves in northwestern Anatolia during the previous century, were beginning to expand across the Dardanelles into European territories. Their military capabilities and expansionist ambitions represented a challenge fundamentally different from the declining Byzantine Empire or the fragmented Bulgarian kingdoms that Dušan had conquered so successfully. Dušan's recognition of the Ottoman threat demonstrated his continued strategic acumen even at the height of his success. Unlike many contemporary European rulers who dismissed the Turks as another nomadic group that could be contained through traditional diplomatic or military means, Dušan understood that Ottoman expansion represented an existential threat to Christian rule in southeastern Europe. His response to this challenge would become his most ambitious undertaking and, ultimately, his final project. The Grand Alliance that Dušan attempted to organize during 1355 represented a revolutionary departure from previous Serbian foreign policy. Rather than pursuing the careful balance between Eastern and Western Christianity that had characterized earlier Serbian diplomacy, Dušan proposed to unite all Christian powers, both Orthodox and Catholic, in a great crusade against the advancing Ottoman forces. This ambitious vision required him to overcome centuries of religious and political divisions while also coordinating military activities across vast distances and diverse terrain. The papal negotiations that Dušan initiated during this period demonstrated both his diplomatic sophistication and his understanding of the magnitude of the Ottoman challenge. Pope Innocent VI, like many Western European leaders, was initially skeptical of reports about Ottoman capabilities and ambitions. However, Dušan's persistent diplomatic efforts gradually convinced papal officials that the Turkish threat was real and immediate, requiring coordinated Christian response on a scale not seen since the original Crusades. The military preparations that accompanied these diplomatic initiatives revealed the full extent of Dušan's imperial resources and organizational capabilities. Serbian forces were expanded and reorganized to prepare for campaigns that would extend far beyond the Balkans into Anatolia itself. New alliances were negotiated with Hungarian, Venetian, and other European powers, who could provide naval support, financial resources, and additional military units for the proposed crusading army. The personal transformation that Dušan underwent during this period reflected both his religious convictions and his recognition of his historical responsibilities. The emperor, who had spent his career conquering Christian territories, now dedicated himself to organizing their defense against a common enemy. This shift in focus required him to reconcile former enemies, overcome religious divisions, and create unprecedented levels of cooperation among traditionally competitive powers. The administrative reforms that Dušan implemented in preparation for the crusade demonstrated his understanding that such an ambitious undertaking required institutional changes that would ensure effective coordination of resources and personnel. New governmental offices were created to manage the complex logistics of organizing a multinational military campaign. Financial systems were revised to provide the massive revenues that would be necessary to sustain extended military operations in distant territories. The cultural and religious dimensions of the proposed crusade reflected Dušan's vision of Serbian leadership in defending Eastern Orthodox Christianity while also working with Western Catholic powers toward common objectives. Serbian Orthodox clergy were encouraged to emphasize the religious significance of the struggle against Ottoman expansion, while also building bridges with Catholic counterparts who shared similar concerns about Turkish advances. The personal strain that these ambitious preparations placed on Dušan became increasingly apparent during the final months of 1355. The emperor, who had previously demonstrated remarkable energy and resilience, began to show signs of exhaustion as he attempted to coordinate the countless details necessary for organizing the most ambitious military campaign in European history. The psychological pressure of knowing that the survival of Christian rule in southeastern Europe might depend on the success of his enterprise weighed heavily on a ruler who had never before faced challenges of such magnitude. The sudden illness that struck Stefan Dušan in December 1355 came at the worst possible moment for both the empire and the broader Christian cause. The emperor, who had been the driving force behind the proposed crusade and the unifying figure holding together the diverse territories of the Serbian Empire, was struck down just as his most ambitious plans were reaching fruition. The circumstances of his illness and death remain mysterious, with some contemporary sources suggesting poisoning while others attribute his demise to exhaustion and the accumulated strains of his remarkably active life. The immediate impact of Dušan's death on December 20th, 1355, sent shockwaves throughout Europe and fundamentally altered the balance of power in southeastern Europe. The proposed crusade against the Ottomans collapsed immediately as the various Christian powers that Dušan had been attempting to coordinate lost the leadership and coordination that only he could provide. More ominously for Serbian interests, the emperor's death created an immediate succession crisis that would test the stability of the institutions he had created. The death of Stefan Dušan the Mighty created an immediate crisis that would test whether the Serbian Empire could survive the loss of its founder and the mounting pressures that threatened its continued existence. The young prince who inherited the imperial title as Stefan Uroš V faced challenges that would have overwhelmed even the most experienced ruler, let alone an inexperienced youth who had been thrust into power at one of the most dangerous moments in Serbian history. The 16 years of his reign would witness the gradual disintegration of the greatest Serbian state ever created, as centrifugal forces that Dušan had successfully contained during his lifetime began to tear the empire apart. Stefan Uroš V was approximately 19 years old when he assumed the imperial throne. an age that might have been adequate for peaceful succession under normal circumstances, but was woefully insufficient for the crises that immediately confronted the Serbian Empire. Unlike his father, who had spent years preparing for imperial responsibilities through military campaigns and administrative experience, the young emperor had been given little opportunity to develop the skills necessary for governing a multi-ethnic empire spanning half of southeastern Europe. The epithet, the Weak, by which Uroš V became known to history, reflected not only his personal inadequacies as a ruler, but also the impossible position in which circumstances had placed him. The empire he inherited was simultaneously at the peak of its territorial extent and facing the gravest external threats in Serbian history. The delicate balance of forces that Dušan had maintained through personal authority, military prestige, and diplomatic skill began to collapse almost immediately after his death. The most immediate challenge facing the new emperor was the collapse of his father's ambitious plans for a Christian crusade against the advancing Ottoman forces. The European alliance that Dušan had been carefully constructing dissolved within months of his death, as the various Christian powers that had been willing to follow his leadership were unwilling to entrust their resources to an untested youth. This diplomatic failure had catastrophic consequences, as it left the Serbian Empire to face the Ottoman threat in isolation rather than as part of a coordinated Christian response. The administrative crisis that emerged during the early years of Uroš's reign revealed the extent to which the empire's governance had depended on Dušan's personal authority and energy. The sophisticated governmental institutions that had been created during the previous decade proved inadequate for maintaining central control when they were not backed by a ruler capable of commanding respect and obedience from powerful regional governors. Professional administrators who had served effectively under Dušan found themselves unable to implement imperial policies when local magnates chose to ignore or openly defy imperial commands. The economic foundations of the empire began to erode as regional lords redirected tax revenues from imperial coffers to their own treasuries. The silver mines that had provided crucial resources for imperial administration were gradually seized by local magnates who used their wealth to build independent power bases rather than supporting central authority. Trade networks that had flourished under imperial protection began to fragment as merchants found themselves subject to multiple and conflicting jurisdictions rather than uniform imperial law. The military crisis that developed during Uroš's reign was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the empire's decline. The professional military forces that Dušan had created to defend and expand the empire began to disintegrate as regional commanders transferred their loyalty from the emperor to local magnates who could provide more reliable compensation and advancement opportunities. Without effective central military authority, the empire became vulnerable to both internal rebellion and external invasion. The emergence of powerful regional magnates as virtually independent rulers represented the most visible manifestation of imperial decline. Nobles who had served as provincial governors under Dušan began to act as autonomous rulers within their own territories, maintaining their own military forces, conducting independent diplomacy, and governing according to their own interests rather than imperial policy. This feudal fragmentation transformed the once unified empire into a collection of competing principalities that often worked at cross purposes. Among the most powerful of these regional magnates was Uglješa Mrnjavčević, who controlled substantial territories in eastern Macedonia and assumed the title of despot while maintaining only nominal loyalty to the emperor. His younger brother, Vukašin Mrnjavčević, established himself as the dominant power in western Macedonia and eventually claimed royal status for himself. These brothers represented a new generation of Serbian nobles who were more interested in building their own dynasties than in preserving the unity of Dušan's empire. The Balšić family emerged as the dominant power in the coastal regions of Montenegro and northern Albania, effectively ending imperial control over the Adriatic territories that had been crucial to Serbian commercial and strategic interests. Their independence demonstrated how quickly the empire's peripheral territories could break away when central authority weakened, creating a precedent that encouraged similar separatist movements throughout the empire. In the northern territories that had been incorporated into the empire during Dušan's expansion, local magnates like Nikola Altomanović established autonomous rule that ignored imperial authority entirely. These developments meant that within a decade of Dušan's death, the emperor's effective authority had been reduced to a fraction of the territories that his father had controlled at the height of imperial power. The religious dimension of the empire's decline created additional complications for maintaining unity among the diverse populations that comprised Dušan's former territories. The Serbian Patriarchate that had been established to provide ecclesiastical legitimacy for imperial rule found itself caught between competing loyalties as regional magnates demanded religious recognition for their independence. The Orthodox Church's attempts to mediate between the emperor and rebellious nobles often resulted in compromising its own authority and credibility. The external pressures that mounted during Uroš's reign created a vicious cycle that accelerated imperial disintegration. The Ottoman Turks, who had been contained during Dušan's lifetime through the threat of coordinated Christian resistance, now faced a fragmented Serbian empire that could offer only token opposition to their continued expansion. Ottoman forces began probing Serbian defenses while also cultivating relationships with Serbian magnates, who might be willing to accept Turkish suzerainty in exchange for protection against their domestic rivals. The Hungarian kingdom, which had maintained careful relations with Dušan's empire, began to assert claims over northern Serbian territories that had been disputed during previous decades. Hungarian intervention in Serbian affairs was facilitated by the empire's internal divisions, as regional magnates sometimes sought Hungarian support against their rivals or against the ineffective central government. The economic consequences of imperial fragmentation extended far beyond the immediate loss of tax revenues and military resources. Commercial networks that had flourished under unified imperial authority began to break down as merchants found themselves subject to multiple taxation systems and competing legal jurisdictions. The standardized currency that Dušan had established was gradually replaced by local coinages that reflected the political fragmentation of his former territories. Cultural achievements that had flourished during the empire's golden age began to decline as patronage became fragmented among competing regional courts that lacked the resources and vision to maintain the sophisticated cultural synthesis that had characterized Dušan's reign. Monasteries and schools that had been supported by imperial resources found themselves dependent on local patrons whose interests were often more limited than those of the former imperial administration. The diplomatic isolation that characterized the latter years of Uroš's reign reflected the empire's declining international status and influence. European powers that had once sought Serbian alliance or at least accommodation now largely ignored the fragmented Serbian territories while focusing their attention on more significant threats and opportunities. This isolation made it increasingly difficult for Serbian leaders to obtain the foreign support that might have enabled them to resist Ottoman expansion or maintain internal unity. The personal tragedy of Stefan Uroš V was that he understood the magnitude of the crisis facing his empire but lacked the personal authority and institutional support necessary to address it effectively. Contemporary accounts describe him as an intelligent and well-intentioned ruler who was overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. His attempts to reassert imperial authority were consistently frustrated by the superior resources and independence of regional magnates who had effectively carved up his father's empire among themselves. The death of Stefan Uroš V in December 1371 marked not only the end of the Nemanjić dynasty, but also the beginning of the most catastrophic period in medieval Serbian history. With no legitimate heir to claim the imperial throne, the fragmented territories of the former Serbian Empire descended into complete political chaos as regional magnates abandoned all pretense of loyalty to central authority and began openly competing for supremacy. This final collapse of Serbian unity occurred at precisely the moment when coordinated resistance was most desperately needed to confront the advancing Ottoman forces that were now poised to exploit Serbian divisions for their own expansionist objectives. The immediate aftermath of the last emperor's death revealed the extent to which the Serbian Empire had already disintegrated during his ineffective reign. Rather than attempting to elect a new emperor or establish some form of collective leadership, the powerful regional lords who had carved up Dušan's territories among themselves moved quickly to formalize their independence and eliminate any remaining vestiges of imperial authority. The speed with which these magnates abandoned the imperial framework demonstrated that their previous nominal loyalty to Uroš had been maintained only as long as it served their individual interests. The most powerful of these emerging regional rulers were the Nemanjić brothers, Vukašin and Uglješa, who had spent the previous decade building autonomous principalities in the heart of the former empire's Macedonian territories. Vukašin, who controlled the western Macedonian regions around Prilep, had already assumed the title of king during Uroš's lifetime, explicitly challenging imperial authority and establishing himself as an independent monarch. His brother Uglješa, who governed the eastern Macedonian territories around Saras, held the title of despot and commanded military forces that rivaled those of any contemporary Balkan ruler. The relationship between the Nemanjić brothers represented both the potential for Serbian recovery and the tragic divisions that ultimately made effective resistance impossible. Their combined territories encompassed some of the wealthiest and most strategically important regions of the former empire, including crucial trade routes and productive agricultural areas that could have provided the economic foundation for organizing resistance to Ottoman expansion. However, their inability to coordinate effectively with each other and with other Serbian regional lords meant that their individual strengths were never combined into a unified defensive effort. The strategic situation that confronted these Serbian regional rulers in 1371 was fundamentally different from anything their predecessors had faced. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Murad I had evolved far beyond the relatively modest principality that had first crossed into Europe 2 decades earlier. The Ottomans now controlled most of Thrace and had established permanent military bases that could support sustained campaigns throughout the Balkans. Most ominously, Ottoman military capabilities had been proven in numerous successful campaigns that had demonstrated their superiority over traditional Balkan military methods. The Ottoman strategy for conquering the fragmented Serbian territories reflected sophisticated understanding of both military tactics and political psychology. Rather than attempting to conquer all Serbian territories simultaneously, Ottoman commanders focused their efforts on eliminating the most dangerous regional rulers, while encouraging others to accept Turkish suzerainty voluntarily. This approach minimized Ottoman military losses while maximizing the psychological impact of their victories on other potential opponents. The military preparations that the Nemanjić brothers undertook during 1371 demonstrated both their recognition of the Ottoman threat and their continued faith in traditional Serbian military capabilities. They assembled what contemporary sources describe as one of the largest armies ever gathered by Serbian forces, drawing soldiers not only from their own territories but also from other Serbian regional lords who recognized that Ottoman success against the Nemanjić brothers would inevitably lead to attacks on their own principalities. The army that marched to confront the Ottoman forces in September 1371 represented the last great effort by medieval Serbian military tradition to resist foreign conquest through conventional warfare. The Serbian forces included the heavy cavalry that had been the backbone of Serbian military success for over 2 centuries, supported by infantry units drawn from throughout the former empire's territories. Contemporary estimates suggest that the combined Serbian army numbered between 60,000 and 70,000 soldiers, making it one of the largest military forces assembled in 14th century Europe. The strategic decision to meet the Ottoman forces near the Maritsa River reflected traditional Serbian military thinking that emphasized the importance of controlling river crossings and defensive positions. The Maritsa region had been the site of numerous previous military encounters, and Serbian commanders believed that the terrain would favor their traditional tactical methods while limiting the effectiveness of Ottoman military innovations. However, this strategic approach failed to account for the revolutionary changes that had occurred in military technology and organization during the previous decades. The Battle of Maritsa, fought on September 26, 1371, began with a night attack that caught the Serbian forces completely unprepared for the tactical innovations that Ottoman military commanders had developed. Unlike previous Balkan armies that the Serbs had encountered, Ottoman forces combined traditional cavalry charges with disciplined infantry formations supported by advanced siege equipment and coordinated archery units. The surprise assault shattered Serbian defensive positions before organized resistance could be mounted. The collapse of Serbian resistance during the battle was so rapid and complete that contemporary chroniclers struggled to explain how such a large and apparently well-equipped army could be destroyed so thoroughly by forces that were probably smaller in number. The Serbian heavy cavalry that had dominated Balkan battlefields for generations proved ineffective against Ottoman tactical formations that had been specifically designed to counter traditional European military methods. The death of King Vukašin and despot Uglješa during the early phases of the battle eliminated the leadership necessary for organizing any coherent retreat or regrouping effort. The casualties suffered by Serbian forces at Maritsa were catastrophic, not only in numerical terms, but also in their impact on Serbian political and military leadership. The battle eliminated much of the Serbian nobility that had governed the former empire's territories, creating a leadership vacuum that would persist for generations. The loss of experienced military commanders meant that future Serbian resistance efforts would be led by inexperienced leaders who lacked both the tactical knowledge and the political authority necessary for organizing effective opposition to Ottoman expansion. The immediate consequences of the Maritsa disaster extended far beyond the military sphere to encompass fundamental changes in the balance of power throughout southeastern Europe. The demonstration of Ottoman military superiority convinced many remaining Serbian regional lords that resistance was futile and that their best hope for survival lay in accepting Turkish suzerainty rather than risking annihilation through continued opposition. This psychological collapse proved to be as significant as the military defeat in determining the future of Serbian independence. The diplomatic revolution that followed the battle saw numerous Serbian nobles voluntarily submitting to Ottoman authority in exchange for guarantees that they could retain control over their territories as Turkish vassals. This pragmatic accommodation reflected realistic assessment of the military situation, but it also represented the abandonment of the independence that had characterized Serbian political development for over 2 centuries. The speed with which Serbian nobles accepted vassal status demonstrated their understanding that the traditional Balkan political system had been permanently altered by Ottoman military superiority. The economic consequences of the battle were equally devastating for Serbian prospects of recovery. The territories controlled by the Nemanjić brothers had been among the wealthiest regions of the former empire, providing tax revenues and commercial opportunities that could have supported continued resistance efforts. The Ottoman conquest of these territories eliminated the economic foundation that would have been necessary for organizing future military campaigns, while also providing the Turks with additional resources for further expansion. The religious and cultural implications of the Maritsa defeat created long-term consequences that extended far beyond immediate political and military considerations. The battle marked the beginning of Ottoman control over territories that contained some of the most important Orthodox monasteries and churches in the Balkans, creating challenges for maintaining Serbian religious and cultural identity under foreign rule. The loss of political independence also meant the loss of the patronage system that had supported Serbian cultural development during the previous centuries. The strategic implications of Ottoman victory at Maritsa transformed the entire dynamic of Balkan politics by eliminating the last significant organized resistance to Turkish expansion in the central Balkan regions. With the destruction of the most powerful Serbian army and the death of the most capable Serbian military leaders, the Ottoman Empire was free to pursue its expansion goals without facing coordinated opposition from the fragmented Serbian territories. The 18 years that separated the catastrophic defeat at Maritsa from the legendary battle at Kosovo field witnessed a remarkable effort by the surviving Serbian territories to rebuild their strength and organize one final resistance to Ottoman expansion. This period of recovery was dominated by the emergence of Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović, who would transform himself from a regional lord governing the northern Serbian territories into the acknowledged leader of a Christian coalition that represented the last hope for maintaining independence in southeastern Europe. The battle that would make both his name and Kosovo field legendary occurred on St. Vitus Day, June 15, 1389, and would forever alter the course of Balkan history. Prince Lazar had emerged from the wreckage of the former Serbian Empire as the ruler of what contemporary sources called Moravian Serbia, encompassing the northern territories that had been the original heartland of the Nemanjić dynasty. Unlike the southern regions that had been devastated at Maritsa or had submitted to Ottoman vassalage, Lazar's principality retained both its independence and its military capabilities. The geographic advantages of his northern territories, protected by the Danube River and the Carpathian foothills, provided natural defensive barriers that had enabled him to resist Ottoman pressure while rebuilding Serbian strength. The process of reconstruction that Lazar undertook during the 1370s and 1380s demonstrated both the resilience of Serbian political institutions and the desperate nature of the situation facing the remaining independent territories. Lazar systematically rebuilt the administrative, military, and economic foundations that would be necessary for mounting effective resistance to Ottoman expansion. His success in this endeavor reflected not only his personal capabilities as a ruler, but also the deep reserves of loyalty and determination that existed among the Serbian population despite their recent disasters. The diplomatic revolution that Lazar orchestrated during the years preceding Kosovo represented one of the most sophisticated efforts at alliance building in medieval Balkan history. Recognizing that Serbian forces alone would be insufficient to resist Ottoman military superiority, he pursued an ambitious strategy of creating a multi-ethnic Christian coalition that could coordinate resistance efforts throughout southeastern Europe. This approach required overcoming centuries of religious and ethnic divisions while also managing the competing interests of various regional powers. The most significant diplomatic achievement of Lazar's reign was his alliance with King Tvrtko I of Bosnia, whose kingdom had managed to maintain its independence despite the Ottoman advances that had overwhelmed other Balkan states. The Bosnian contribution to the coalition that would face the Ottomans at Kosovo included experienced military units under the command of Vlatko Vuković, one of the most capable military commanders in southeastern Europe. This Bosnian participation demonstrated that resistance to Ottoman expansion could still attract significant regional support. The alliance negotiations that preceded Kosovo also included representatives from various Albanian, Bulgarian, and even Hungarian territories, creating a coalition that represented the most comprehensive Christian resistance effort since the collapse of the crusading movement that Stefan Dušan had attempted to organize 30 years earlier. The diversity of this coalition reflected both the widespread nature of the Ottoman threat and the continuing appeal of Serbian leadership among Orthodox Christian populations throughout the region. However, perhaps the most complex relationship within the Christian coalition involved Vuk Branković, the powerful Serbian magnate who controlled significant territories in the Kosovo region itself. Brankovic's position was particularly delicate because his lands bordered directly on Ottoman territories, making him vulnerable to immediate retaliation if the coalition's resistance efforts failed. His participation in Lazar's alliance demonstrated the continuing loyalty of Serbian regional lords to the cause of independence, but it also created tensions that would have significant consequences during the battle itself. The military preparations that characterized the years leading up to Kosovo reflected Lazar's understanding that success would require not only numerical superiority, but also tactical innovations that could counter the Ottoman military advantages demonstrated at Maritsa. Serbian military engineers studied reports of Ottoman tactics and equipment while developing countermeasures that might enable traditional Serbian military capabilities to compete effectively with Turkish innovations. These preparations included improvements in armor and weapons, as well as training in new tactical formations. The economic foundation for these military preparations came from the continued prosperity of the northern Serbian territories under Lazar's rule. The silver mines that had long supported Serbian royal finances continued to provide revenues that enabled the principality to maintain professional military forces, while also supporting the diplomatic activities necessary for building the Christian coalition. Trade relationships with Hungary and other northern European powers provided access to advanced military equipment and tactical expertise. The religious dimensions of the approaching conflict created additional complications that required careful management by Lazar and his advisors. The multi-ethnic nature of the Christian coalition meant that both Orthodox and Catholic populations would be fighting together against the Muslim Ottoman forces, potentially creating the kind of religious cooperation that had been attempted during the original Crusades centuries earlier. The Serbian Orthodox Church played a crucial role in legitimizing this cooperation while also emphasizing the defensive nature of the Christian cause. Sultan Murad I, who would lead the Ottoman forces at Kosovo, represented the culmination of early Ottoman military and political development. Under his leadership, the Ottoman Empire had evolved from a modest Anatolian principality into a major European power that controlled most of Thrace and had established permanent bases throughout the southern Balkans. His decision to personally lead the campaign against the Christian coalition demonstrated both his recognition of the threat they represented and his confidence in Ottoman military superiority. The Ottoman army that assembled for the Kosovo campaign reflected the sophisticated military organization that had enabled Turkish success throughout their European expansion. Professional Janissary units formed the core of the Ottoman forces, supported by traditional cavalry formations and auxiliary troops drawn from throughout the empire's territories. The inclusion of Serbian vassals who had submitted after Maritsa created the tragic situation where Serbs would be fighting on both sides of the conflict. The strategic importance of Kosovo Field as the chosen battlefield reflected considerations that went beyond immediate tactical advantages. The region had been the economic heartland of the medieval Serbian Empire, containing some of the wealthiest agricultural territories and most important urban centers in the Balkans. Control over Kosovo would provide access to the major trade routes connecting the Danube basin with the Aegean Sea, while also demonstrating the victor's claim to supremacy over the former Serbian imperial territories. The battle itself, fought on the morning of June 15, 1389, began with a coordinated attack by the Christian coalition forces that initially achieved significant success against the Ottoman lines. The Serbian heavy cavalry, supported by Bosnian and Albanian units, managed to break through Ottoman defensive positions and create the possibility of a decisive victory that might have altered the entire course of Balkan history. However, the tactical superiority that had enabled Ottoman success at Maritsa ultimately proved decisive at Kosovo as well. The death of Sultan Murad during the battle, reportedly at the hands of the Serbian knight Miloš Obilić, created a moment of crisis for the Ottoman forces that might have led to their defeat under different circumstances. However, the rapid assumption of command by Murad's son Bayezid prevented the kind of collapse that might have resulted from leaderless confusion. The new sultan's immediate execution of his brother Yaqub eliminated potential succession disputes while consolidating Ottoman command authority. The corresponding death of Prince Lazar during the later phases of the battle eliminated the Christian coalition's primary leader and ensured that any temporary advantages gained during the early fighting could not be exploited effectively. Contemporary accounts suggest that Lazar was captured during the fighting and subsequently executed, though the exact circumstances of his death became the subject of legendary elaboration in later Serbian literature and oral tradition. The immediate aftermath of Kosovo left both sides claiming victory while also suffering losses that would have long-term consequences for their future capabilities. The Ottoman forces retained control of the battlefield and eliminated the most significant organized resistance to their European expansion, but they had also suffered casualties that required them to suspend further major campaigns for several years. The Christian coalition had failed to halt Ottoman expansion, but significant numbers of their forces had survived to continue resistance efforts under new leadership. The aftermath of Kosovo Field created a paradoxical situation that would define the final 70 years of medieval Serbian independence. Despite suffering catastrophic losses and the death of their primary leader, the Serbian territories had not been conquered outright by the Ottoman forces. Instead, a complex arrangement emerged that would allow Serbian political institutions to survive in modified form while gradually being absorbed into the expanding Ottoman Empire. This prolonged death struggle of medieval Serbia would witness both remarkable cultural achievements and desperate military resistance as successive Serbian rulers attempted to preserve their independence against increasingly impossible odds. The immediate crisis following Prince Lazar's death at Kosovo was resolved through the remarkable leadership of his widow, Princess Milica, who assumed the regency on behalf of their young son, Stefan Lazarević. Milica faced a situation that would have challenged the most experienced statesman. The Serbian Principality had lost much of its military strength and political leadership, while the Ottoman Empire, despite its own losses at Kosovo, remained the dominant power in southeastern Europe with the clear intention of completing its conquest of the remaining Christian territories. The diplomatic solution that Princess Milica negotiated with the new Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I represented a pragmatic accommodation to overwhelming Ottoman military superiority. The agreement that was reached around 1390 established Serbia as a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, with Serbian rulers maintaining internal autonomy while acknowledging Ottoman suzerainty and providing military assistance for Turkish campaigns. This arrangement allowed Serbian institutions to survive, while also providing the Ottomans with additional military resources and administrative expertise. The personal dimension of this diplomatic accommodation involved the marriage of Princess Olivera, Lazar's youngest daughter, to Sultan Bayezid himself, creating a direct family connection between the Serbian ruling house and the Ottoman dynasty. This dynastic marriage served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Serbian submission to Ottoman authority, provided guarantees for the agreement's implementation, and created potential channels of influence that might benefit Serbian interests within the Ottoman system. The transformation of Serbia from an independent principality into an Ottoman vassal state required fundamental changes in governmental structure and foreign policy orientation. Serbian rulers could no longer pursue independent diplomatic initiatives or maintain autonomous military forces beyond what was necessary for internal administration and the fulfillment of their obligations to the Ottoman Empire. However, within these constraints, Serbian institutions retained considerable authority over domestic affairs and cultural matters. Stefan Lazarević, who gradually assumed full authority from his mother during the 1390s, proved to be one of the most remarkable rulers in Serbian history, despite the limitations imposed by his vassal status. His reign, which lasted until 1427, demonstrated that political subjugation did not necessarily preclude cultural and economic achievement. Under his leadership, the Serbian Despotate, as his realm came to be known, experienced a cultural renaissance that rivaled the achievements of the great medieval Serbian kingdoms. The military obligations that vassalage imposed on Serbian rulers created the paradoxical situation where Serbian forces fought alongside Ottoman armies in campaigns against Christian enemies. Stefan Lazarević personally led Serbian contingents in Ottoman campaigns against Hungary and other European powers, demonstrating his loyalty to his Ottoman overlords while also gaining valuable military experience. This collaboration provided Serbian forces with exposure to advanced Ottoman military techniques while also creating opportunities for Serbian commanders to establish reputations for competence and reliability. The economic recovery that occurred during Stefan Lazarević's reign reflected both the stability that Ottoman protection provided and the despot's skilled management of his reduced territories. The silver mines that had long supported Serbian royal finances continued to operate under the new arrangement, providing revenues that enabled the despotate to maintain sophisticated governmental institutions and cultural patronage. Trade relationships were re-established with European partners who were willing to work within the Ottoman political framework. The cultural achievements of the Serbian Despotate during this period represented a remarkable flowering of artistic and intellectual activity that occurred despite the principality's political subordination. The court that Stefan Lazarević established in Belgrade became a center of learning and artistic patronage that attracted scholars and artists from throughout Europe. The synthesis of Serbian traditions with influences from both the Ottoman East and the Hungarian West created unique forms of cultural expression that would influence Balkan civilization for centuries. The architectural projects that were undertaken during Stefan Lazarević's reign demonstrated the continuing vitality of Serbian artistic traditions despite the political changes that had occurred. The reconstruction and expansion of Belgrade's fortifications created one of the most impressive fortress complexes in southeastern Europe, while new churches and monasteries showed that Serbian religious and artistic life remained vigorous under the despotate system. The literary achievements of this period, particularly the works produced in the monastery scriptoriums that Stefan Lazarević supported, preserved and transmitted Serbian historical and cultural traditions, while also creating new forms of expression that reflected contemporary concerns. The chronicle literature that was produced during this period provided detailed accounts of recent Serbian history, while also developing the legendary narratives surrounding Kosovo and other crucial events in Serbian national memory. The succession crisis that followed Stefan Lazarević's death in 1427 brought the Branković family to power as the new ruling dynasty of the Serbian Despotate. Đurađ Branković, who was related to the previous ruling house through marriage connections, faced the challenge of maintaining Serbian autonomy during a period when Ottoman policy toward vassal states was becoming increasingly restrictive. His reign would witness the final attempts at achieving genuine Serbian independence and the ultimate failure of those efforts. The strategic situation that confronted Đurađ Branković during the 1430s and 1440s was fundamentally different from what earlier Serbian rulers had faced. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Murad II had consolidated its control over most of southeastern Europe and was now pursuing a policy of direct annexation rather than vassalage for territories that it considered strategically important. The survival of Serbian autonomy required constant diplomatic maneuvering and occasional military resistance against increasingly impossible odds. The fortress of Smederevo, which Đurađ Branković constructed during the 1420s and 1430s, represented both the height of Serbian defensive architecture and a symbol of the despotate's determination to maintain some measure of independence. The massive fortifications that were built along the Danube River created what was arguably the strongest defensive position in the Balkans, providing a base from which Serbian forces could resist Ottoman pressure while also serving as a refuge for the Serbian population during periods of military crisis. The diplomatic efforts that Branković pursued during his reign demonstrated the limited options available to small Christian states attempting to maintain independence in an increasingly Ottoman-dominated region. His negotiations with Hungary, Venice, and other European powers reflected desperate attempts to secure foreign support for Serbian resistance, but these efforts were consistently undermined by the unwillingness of Western European powers to commit substantial resources to Balkan conflicts. The military campaigns that characterized the final decades of Serbian independence revealed both the continuing fighting spirit of the Serbian population and the futility of resistance against overwhelming Ottoman superiority. Serbian forces achieved occasional tactical victories that demonstrated their continued military capabilities, but these successes could not offset the fundamental imbalance of resources that favored Ottoman expansion. The siege of Constantinople in 1453, which resulted in the final collapse of the Byzantine Empire, eliminated the last major Christian power in southeastern Europe and left the Serbian Despotate completely isolated in its resistance to Ottoman expansion. The fall of Constantinople demonstrated that no Christian state in the region could expect to maintain independence indefinitely against Ottoman military and administrative superiority. The final Ottoman campaign against the Serbian Despotate in 1459 represented the culmination of decades of gradual pressure and the ultimate triumph of Ottoman imperial organization over Serbian resistance. The siege and capture of Smederevo in June 1459 eliminated the last major Serbian stronghold and completed the Ottoman conquest of the Serbian territories that had maintained some form of independence since the original Slavic settlements of the 7th century. The death of the last Serbian despot and the annexation of the remaining Serbian territories marked the end of more than 7 centuries of Serbian statehood and the beginning of over 3 centuries of direct Ottoman rule. However, the cultural and religious institutions that had been preserved during the despotate period provided the foundation for maintaining Serbian identity throughout the long period of foreign domination that followed. The transformation of political defeat into cultural memory ensured that the legacy of the medieval Serbian Empire would survive long after the empire itself had disappeared. The legendary narratives that had been developed around Kosovo, the architectural monuments that testified to Serbian cultural achievement, and the religious institutions that preserved Serbian traditions would provide the foundation for the eventual revival of Serbian independence in the modern era.